Hello, romance lovers. Today's story is called The Revenge of the Lady on the White Horse. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss out on more exciting stories. Every violator, sooner or later, has to pay for his sins. Today, a pretty girl at first glance, Evelina Demi, was forced to publicly admit to cheating. However, the lady herself, the main character of this story, could not confirm the fact of her betrayal. On the contrary, the girl said that she had never cheated. Listening to the accused, the spectators of the execution were simply furious. She is a witch, a girl who killed her own husband, cut off her head from her shoulders, the witnesses of the penal servitude shouted. Having demanded that the common people remain silent, one of the prison managers then explained to the girl that now was her last chance to repent before God. And who knew that in fact the girl was not entirely guilty? Or rather, the evil she had committed was not of her own free will. So earlier, a little boy was asked to take and hand over a certain potion to Duchess Evelina. The young man asked the boy to fulfill his request just before the princess was beheaded. And after that, the young man promised the boy to find her, even when he himself ended up in the past. Meanwhile, aristocrat Evelyn Demi was asked for the last time whether she would confess to killing her own husband, Count Demi Daniel, in an attempt to destroy evidence of her infidelity. Daniel Demi was Evelina's beloved husband. Now, when the girl only remembered the deceased sadly, she could only hope that she would be able to get to the truth when she was reunited with him after death. Unfortunately, the innocent young girl never knew who was really behind the collapse of her family and the unexpected death of her father. Who could it be? It is currently unknown. The devil behind this sad accusation, who sent Evelina to the guillotine. Since the lady was indeed telling the truth, not admitting her guilt, the representative of the Demi family was not afraid to demonstratively declare that only God knows the truth. Even in such a terrible moment, seconds before her own death, the lady continued to defend her honor and explain that she had never done anything reprehensible. When it was time to pay for her sins, the girl was grabbed by the head by force, and at that moment she saw the image of her own mother. To make her last moments less terrible, the lady mentally repeated apologies in her head, asking her mother to turn away and not remember her like that. Let the woman remember her as her soft, kind daughter. But at that moment, while the execution was going on, Evelina suddenly noticed another familiar image. Her dead husband, Daniel, was standing straight ahead, looking at the unpleasant scene. At that moment, Evelina felt as she had never felt before. Could that be possible? After all, the girl had personally seen him dead. Moreover, in the last seconds of her life, the princess noticed a scar on the guy's forehead. For 6 months, the girl lived in madness, trying to find out the truth. The young lady believed that she simply had to find the people who killed her husband. And one day, the girl received an anonymous letter. The letter asked her to come to the last room of a hotel on the outskirts of the capital. The room the letter led her to was in disarray, as if there had been a hot affair there the night before. That same day, Mistress Evelina suddenly met Lord Edward Bailey. Before the boys could even exchange glances, a second later the royal guards ran into the chambers. Without warning, the girl was arrested along with Lord Bailey and thrown into prison on charges of treason, a capital crime in the kingdom. The young princess became the traitor of the century and the prime suspect in the murder of her other half. Now, when in the present time the lady was lying on the floor, not showing any signs of life, people continued to accuse her of infidelity and murder of her entire family. Someone even considered Evelina a witch. But Demi herself did not close her eyes forever. After a while, the lady seemed to be immersed in light. The first thing Miss thought was that she was in the afterlife. At that moment, a little girl ran up to the heroine and asked her to buy some flowers. At that moment, it seemed as if life after death was so different from life before. At that moment, Evelina felt sorry for the unfamiliar little girl. That's why she decided to ask the little saleswoman how she died. At that moment, the preschooler only considered her aunt crazy and quickly ran to her mother. As soon as Evelina was left alone, she unexpectedly met the already familiar image of Daniel passing by. Since the heroine continued to think that she was now in the afterlife, the girl was that her husband had also died, and now they were here together. However, before the punishment, she saw someone in the crowd who looked very much like Daniel, although Madame could simply be mistaken. A dead husband watching his own wife's mortal punishment, it simply did not make sense. Without thinking twice, the girl decided to run up to her boyfriend and shouted loudly, "Daniel, it's me, your—" But before the lady could finish speaking, the guy just coldly pushed her away. "How did you know my name?" The young man only asked in response. Literally, a few seconds later, a horse appeared before the children's eyes. The animal ran straight towards the little girl who was selling a bouquet. At that moment, Evelina remembered how in her past life, her boyfriend told her the origin of his scar. It happened in the marketplace, and Daniel saved the child from the horse. Besides, the prince had said back then that it had happened before they had met. Moreover, the loving guy had asked the lady of his heart not to worry about his scar, and the prince himself had been only too happy to receive from God a meeting with his destiny, the beautiful Lady Evelina, in return for this sacrifice. But now, when the girl looked at Daniel, she no longer saw any scar. Now the man did not recognize the lady he had loved with all his heart in his past life. It seemed that Daniel was not familiar with the heroine at all. Horse, child, marketplace. And although Evelina knew that it sounded meaningless, deep down she supposed that instead of the afterlife, what was happening around her could be the real past. It was easy to guess that all this meant that Prince Demi would save that girl, because he said he would do it himself. But now the guy was not going to budge at all. He just continued to stand next to the stranger and ask her name. The lady had no choice but to save the child from the ill-mannered beast herself. But the reborn woman still lacked courage. When she ran up to the baby, she could only cover the child with her body, without moving from her place. At that very moment, like Superman, the stranger picked up the young girl with the child in her arms, directing them away from the horse. "Sorry, I'm late, Evelina Cordelia." The rescuer guy apologized afterward, looking closely at the lady's appearance. In the end, he promised to meet the girl again, but for now he only advised her to try to stay alive. Then he disappeared from sight in an instant. Who was it? While the lady still did not realize, as soon as the noblewoman came to her senses, she paid attention to the reasoning of other people. Passers-by were worried whether everything would be okay with her after what had happened. But people also paid attention to the fact that the girl called the Duke by name, and this could mean that they know each other and he will help her. The guy also heard the discussions of ordinary people, so without thinking twice, he decided to go closer to the stranger, in order to finally have the pleasure of finding out her name. That day, the girl was unable to introduce herself completely. Immediately after the mysterious madam said her name, the lady fell to the floor, exhausted. Daniel then asked his assistants to take the girl and return to the palace. After several tedious hours in the luxurious estate of Demi, the pretty girl finally opened her eyes. As soon as Miss came to, she immediately recognized the place already familiar to her. The bright palace of her late ex-husband remained forever in Evelina's memory. Besides, when Evelina looked around carefully, her gaze fell upon a familiar figure. She saw the girl standing next to her. It was Charlotte. In her past life, Charlotte was the first person Evelina could talk to and cry with while trying to cope with the pain of losing her husband. In those terrible days when it seemed like the whole world was falling apart, it was she who supported her, making her feel that there were people left in this world who cared. Lady Osami was her best friend, the person who knew her better than most. They shared not only small talk, but also deep, real experiences that could not be revealed to just anyone. As the daughter of a marquis living in the territory of the Duke of Demi, Charlotte extended a helping hand to Evelina from the very beginning when she just got married and entered the family. It was not easy for the young girl to get used to her new status, to the strict rules of high society, but it was her friend who became her first support. She was always there, even in the most terrible moments. When the heroine suffered a miscarriage, and later the death of her husband, Charlotte did not leave her. The young lady invariably stood by her friend, despite the rumors and gossip that went around. But now something had changed. For some unknown reason, Osami no longer looked like the lady she always was. She was now wearing a modest maid's dress. Why? What had happened? When Evelina opened her eyes, her assistant first asked her how she was feeling with concern, and then successfully reported that the master of the house was currently out hunting. But at that moment, the main character of this story was still guessing only about the reason why Charlotte was doing in Demi's estate as a servant. But from the reaction of the palace employee, it became clear that she had never seen Evelina before. Based on this, the young lady could really be sure that she had really been reborn into her past. To finally confirm her assumption, the girl decided to ask the servant what day it was. The maid answered that it was Wednesday. Then Evelina got angry and ordered him to explain more specifically. Demi was eager to know what year and month it was. If Evelina's premonitions are true, then she must have been scary for Charlotte too. The girl simply had no option to be a strict mistress. As soon as the beauty in a rude tone found out the real date, and at the moment the events are taking place on September 3rd, 9:15, which means that the girl returned to the past 4 years. As hard as it may be to believe, Evelina Demi, the girl who was executed for treason, has actually returned to the past, and this is not a dream. A few hours later, the owner of the chambers returned from hunting. As soon as he noticed that the aristocrat had woken up, he decided to inquire about her well-being. Since the uninvited guest did not want to inconvenience the owner of the mansion, she decided to get out of bed herself as soon as she saw the image of the tenant. But the guy showed hospitality and was not going to fulfill the lady's request right away. The young man then admitted that the only thing that bothered him was that he still hadn't found out the girl's name. "If this isn't too impudent a request, at least ask you again," the owner of the Demi Palace pointed out again. At that moment, the lady thought that if this really was the past, then she had a chance to fix what had happened earlier. Now she had the opportunity to change everything she had experienced after Daniel's death. No, even to fix Daniel's death itself. Evelina had a goal to make events turn out just the way she wanted them to. In order not to delay the answer, the girl decided to introduce herself as the daughter of Count Cordelia, Evelina, that is, to tell the truth. But as soon as she did this, all the people around just laughed loudly. "Are you Cordelia? Who do you think you're talking to?" "Evelyn Cordelia is dead," Daniel said in a rougher tone, drawing his sharp sword blade to point it at the strange woman's neck. According to the young man, Lady Cordelia died about 6 months ago. The poor girl's body was found not far from a high cliff, in such a gloomy place, under a cliff. According to rumors, the fragile aristocrat accidentally fell from the cliff and died on the spot. But how did the main character of this story feel hearing this now? Did she really die? How is this even possible? In turn, Daniel continued to claim that the girl fell off a cliff and died, and the waves broke her into pieces. Evelina still could not accept everything that was happening as true, still not understanding what was happening. The miss only continued to assure that she was the real Cordelia, since she was truly sure of her origin. The girl seemed to be begging to believe her, no matter how strange everything she said sounded. In addition, in her pleas, the lady accidentally mentioned Daniel's name, although in fact the girl could not have known the initials of the crown prince for sure. Based on that, the guest had to tell that she had recently lost her memory and had no explanation for why she had stayed here. Since the guy demanded to explain how she knew his name, the girl chose the tactic of pretending she didn't know why she recognized the man. At the same time, the lady continued to assure that she really needed to survive here. The miss then demanded to be allowed to send the letter, saying that she wanted to tell her father everything. The lady wanted to tell him that Evelina Cordelia was there, but of course no one was going to let her do that. Daniel was so angry that he thought the girl wanted him to do all the work, although killing her here and now would be much easier and more profitable for Demi himself. The only thing that could stop Daniel was his brother. He stood up for the girl and covered the stranger with his body, asking her not to kill the unexpected guest. Then an argument started between the brothers. Daniel thought that this woman was just a fraud, but Lucas thought that one could not be sure and know the whole truth. The younger brother thought that even if this lady really was a fraud, one should first find out her motives and not do anything in a hurry. And yet Lucas was able to calm the elder down a little. When the boys were about to leave the room, the lady shouted after them a statement that she would prove her origin in just 1 week. That would be the time she would need to get an answer. Fortunately, today everything ended well, although Daniel slightly cut Mrs. throat. But this is nothing compared to what was supposed to happen. It's hard to tell right away how the princess managed to survive all this, but it was still too early to feel comfortable. Now the lady understood that she had to prove her true identity as soon as possible. Otherwise, Cordelia's safety was in great danger. When the girl came down for breakfast sometime later, one of the brothers decided to join her. The first thing Lucas wanted to do was apologize on behalf of his brother and inquire about the girl's well-being. It was obvious that he was sincerely sorry that his brother had caused even such a small bodily injury. But Daniel himself, who overheard the young people's conversation, was not delighted with everything that was happening. The man continued to assure his brother that their guest was a nobody whose best excuse was memory loss. In fact, the heroine did not condemn Daniel's suspicions, since they were justified in regard to her. The girl is in fact just a random woman claiming to be the daughter of the Cordelia family, although this does not justify the hostile behavior of Cordelia's former boyfriend. Was he always so evil? He stopped in his tracks even when he saw the horse rushing towards the little girl and impulsively drew his blade. Is this really the Daniel that Evelina knew? In turn, Daniel's younger brother, Lucas Demi, was also an acquaintance of Evelina's in a past life. When the girl married Daniel, Lucas was recovering from his illness. He was unable to attend the wedding and died soon after. The lady was actually always curious to know what kind of person he was. Besides, looking at these two, it was not difficult to notice their similarity. But it was only an external similarity, but not an internal one. And in this life, Madame Evelina noticed how much different a person Demi, who had already been chosen in the past, turned out to be. During the meal, the prince decided to ask why the girl had chosen the initials of Evelina Cordelia out of all the names. By this, he meant that such a noble surname would not serve a fraud. After all, a deceiver could call herself by anyone's name. Besides, Demi considered her behavior stupid. To dress like a peasant and try to pass herself off as a noble person. Since the girl did not want to endure these verbal humiliations from the owner of the palace, without finishing her breakfast, the lady decided to leave. It seemed that she simply could not stand being in such a terrible situation. The girl was calmed only by the fact that there was only a week left until her father took her away. Immediately after, the princess decided to go to her room to write a letter for her father. The first thing she told her father was that she had heard news that Evelina herself had died. The girl admitted that she did not know where these rumors came from and also added that she was completely safe but had lost her memory. However, while the reincarnated woman was writing the letter, she remembered very well that 6 months before her death in the future, Connor Cordelia's father would also die. So, if this was really the past, her father should still be alive. And so the girl was sure that he would come to find his daughter. In the letter, the lady also indicated that she would have to stay at the Duchy of Demi's estate. The lady said that she could not leave on her own and asked the Pope to come to her. Only now the question arose, who should the girl ask to send this letter? The first person who could help the lady in this situation, Charlotte, came to Evelina's mind. But the girls did not get along very well in this life. No matter how sad Evelina would be to admit it, Osami is no longer the kind of person who can be fully trusted. Therefore, the modest girl decided to ask another maid to send a personal letter to the Cordelia estates. That maid was called Sophia. She was the servant who was introduced to Evelina immediately after her wedding with Daniel. She was a very bright girl and always took care of Evelina. In addition, she was hardworking and quick and always kindly helped her mistress in everything. So, if the head maid agrees to send this letter, everything will be fine. And to motivate the woman to fulfill the request in good faith, Evelina promised to give the maid a ring in return. This can be considered as such a payment for a responsible job well done. That day, Sophia promised to make sure the letter would reach its destination. Although Evelina knew that the assistant would probably show the sheet to Daniel and Lucas first, the situation seemed to be a little calmer now. Since the letter would most likely be read by the crown princes of the estate, it could only be beneficial for the uninvited guest. Just considering the fact that a girl can't lie in a letter to her own father, when Demi reads the letter, he will at least not bring his sword to the young lady's throat again. For now, that's enough, if it guarantees the safety of the parishioner. According to the plan, both brothers will have calculated the letter by tomorrow morning. Maybe then they will begin to take the girl at least a little more seriously. That same evening, while passing by the crown prince's estate, Lady Evelina heard strange moans. When the girl decided to take a quick look into the guy's room, she saw something terrible. Daniel was passionately pressing himself against his maid, Charlotte, biting and gently kissing the young lady in her most erogenous zones. This moment seemed so unreal that everything seemed like a dream. How is this even possible? What is this? Charlotte and Daniel? What are they doing? Looking at them, the girl simply could not believe her eyes. At that moment, a picture from her past life also surfaced in the lady's subconscious, when Charlotte, the girl's best friend, comforted her friend with all her heart while she cried over the death of her lover. Osami was the first person who had previously shared all the hardships with her close friend. It was then that Evelina remembered the image of the man she had seen in front of the guillotine. All this meant that at that moment, Daniel Demy himself had really been standing at the scene, watching and enjoying the death of his wife. But had this guy really faked his own death for the sake of some simpleton Charlotte? Fran has long been considered a land of glory, grandeur, and unshakable purity. Here, every family was like a fortress, and the man, being its head, played the role of a protector, support, and indestructible shield. The wife should be a solid foundation on which the family stands. She not only took care of her husband, but was also the embodiment of comfort and well-being. The family was perceived as a sacred union that could not be changed, destroyed, or betrayed. Violation of this union, especially treason, was considered not just a personal act, but a grave crime, tantamount to betrayal of the country itself. And therefore, treason was not simply condemned, it was punished with the utmost severity, without any mercy. It was for this reason that Evelina Cordelia had to be executed. Her name, once spoken with respect and reverence, had become a symbol of a crime unworthy of forgiveness. Her existence could no longer continue, and justice could only be restored in one way: by killing the woman. At that time, no one even thought that this betrayal was just a setup by evil people. But everything that is happening to the main character of this story now, at this very moment, seems completely unreal. Demi's estate, where she found herself, was not an ordinary place. It was like a space outside of time, a shaky line between life and death, like a dream. But even in this, as it would seem, most terrible situation, there are positive moments. Now the girl at least knows how she got here. Princess Evelina was definitely killed by Daniel and Charlotte. It was all because of money. Everything went wrong from the very moment she decided to marry this man. All that remains is to find out what exactly the secret lover's plan was. The Cordelia family had always been known in Fran for their wealth and their ability to make the largest and most profitable trade deals. As one of the major players in the market, they were respected by nobles and ordinary traders, and their fortune grew with each passing year. They had a scale that Demi, a small rural noble family, could never dream of. But after Daniel's death, everything began to fall apart. The worst blow was the accusation brought against Connor Cordelia, Evelina's father. He was unfairly accused of embezzling funds from the state treasury, claiming that he had appropriated vast sums intended for royal needs. He died in an accident shortly after. When her father's funeral took place, Evelina stood at the grave, realizing that nothing remained of her former life. Everything that seemed unshakable was destroyed. But fate gave her an unexpected chance. The lady had the opportunity to relive her own life. She could not allow her father's name to remain tainted by false accusations. And then, when she had enough evidence to finally reveal the truth, everything went completely wrong. That evening, the girl was cruelly framed, supposedly having been found to have cheated on her. And then the lady was sent to the place of execution and accused of killing Daniel. All the evidence she found was left at Demi's estate. In reality, it turned out that Daniel faked his own death and waited for the girl to find the evidence so that he could be the one to clear his father's name after her death. And then, according to the law, all of his ex-wife's assets would go to him. Everything was done only to take possession of all the money of the formerly great and respected Cordelia family. This young guy was so greedy and inhumane that he calmly pulled off such a scam with his wife. Playing this whole terrible situation over in her head, Evelina was even surprised at how she could have been so blind. If you think about it and remember, Charlotte and Daniel always disappeared together, leaving Evelina in the dark. The servants always looked at their mistress with pitying eyes, as if they knew something important. Of course, Evelina did not suspect anything at all and was happy, because her world revolved around her beloved husband, Daniel. In her past life, the young lady preferred to close her eyes to the oddities, as if she did not want to know the truth. Everything passed her by, leaving only a shadow of doubt. Now fate gave her a rare chance to change everything, restore justice, and destroy the rotten foundations of this cruel kingdom of Fran. A little later, the door creaked softly, and the maid Charlotte appeared in the room. She quickly examined Evelina, noticing that she was already awake. In her hands were a change of clothes, prepared for the guests who had unexpectedly lingered in this cold, secretive castle. Just looking into the eyes of this friend, the girl could no longer treat her well at all. At such moments, words from her past life seeped into Evelina's head. "I am always on your side, Evelina. You will be able to find out the truth about all the deaths, about Lord Cordelia and Demi," her close friend assured in her past life. Now Evelina had absolutely no intention of being friends with her, or even treating her with respect. On the contrary, when Charlotte simply came into her room, the girl tried to rudely point out the maid's mistakes. For example, today the worker burst into the room without even knocking on the door. But Charlotte was a lady with character. Therefore, when Evelina only tried to point out her shortcomings, the maid openly called the girl a fraud who should not be here at all. The cleaning lady also explained that his lordship did not throw the guest out only because he truly believed that she was a celebrity. Charlotte insisted that Daniel was a compassionate man and pointed out to Evelina how grateful she should be for taking her in. The assistant also noted that the man did not even allow her to listen to the reason that the girl would come up with for him. Besides, Charlotte considered it obvious that this guy was completely out of Evelina's league. But the main character of this story was not going to quietly tolerate insults towards her. Besides, all these insults were completely unfounded. Now Evelina wanted most of all to teach Charlotte to observe subordination. The maid behaved too freely around her, forgetting about the norms of decency. Lady Cordelia, of course, did not like this, because a servant should know her place and address her mistress with respect as befits a true servant. And before finishing the conversation with this young lady, Evelina demanded to leave the clothes here when she would leave. At that moment, at first glance, the pretty and quiet girl really seemed like a rude swindler. And in fact, Countess Cordelia behaved this way on purpose. She wanted to be like a thorn in Charlotte's side. She did not seek hatred, did not want to overshadow the past friendship with malice. But despite this, she simply could not forgive the maid for what happened, because the pain of betrayal will not disappear with time, even if you are transported back 4 years into your past. But now Evelina faced a much more important question. What to do next? Her destiny had changed, the past no longer had power, and the future seemed uncertain. She knew she couldn't stay in this place without a goal. But what was the next step? While Evelina was thinking, she was interrupted by a quiet but persistent knock on the door. It turned out that it was Sophia who had come to visit the mysterious guest. The nice maid reported that she had sent the letter as her mistress had ordered. The assistant also said that the letter would reach Cordelia in just a couple of days. After that, Sophia handed Evelina the very ring that the Countess had given her earlier. It turns out that the assistant had made sure that the jewelry returned to its true owner, because she understood that its meaning was much deeper than just an expensive thing. Sophia decided that the decoration had a special value for the lady. Moreover, despite the guest's loneliness, she could not accept such an expensive gift in response to the fulfillment of a simple task. For her, it was not just a gesture of politeness, but something more, even though the assistant still fulfilled the request. At that moment, Evelina decided to ask the maid if she believed in the girl's origin. In fact, the woman really believed Evelina. In her opinion, the girl looked very important. That day, the heroine realized that she should not hesitate. She simply did not have time for it. Now it does not matter what and who said, first of all, the heroine is Evelina Cordelia. That night, motivated Evelina Cordelia decided to go to a certain place for her own good. When she arrived at the hut, she directly informed the employee that she needed someone. The matter was about a further ally. Lady Evelina removed her hood and told the employee her request to bring her a mediator. Now Evelina had really shown herself to be strong. The girl would not simply watch as she was ridiculed and disbelieved. After that, the employee reported that if the young lady needed a person, they had 2 services. They could find someone for the lady or kill her. Now Evelina herself had to decide what to choose from this. First of all, without thinking twice, the girl said that a person should be able to kill others. After listening carefully to the guest, the man handed over a special key. Then she had to go to the second room upstairs, where she would meet the same intermediary. The lady only had to make sure that she would not attract attention. In addition, the man reported that the people here were unfriendly. In this area, there is no need to provoke other people to do harm. That night, Lady Evelina remembered all the clues from the hunter well in order to carry out her plan. The reason why Evelina couldn't answer was because she was ignored. The The girl was constantly ignored, especially by her ex-girlfriend from her past life, Charlotte Osami. But are Charlotte and Daniel really dating? In France, what happened to the maid? There are so many questions that the main character of this story will not be able to get answers to anytime soon. In general, it may even be that the new maid is from a little-known noble family. One can even consider the option that it was Charlotte who persuaded others to kill Evelina. In order to prevent this from happening again, Madame needs to find the details she missed in her previous life and, using her second chance, change the course of fate. When the girl carefully looked around the room she found herself in, she noticed that this place was very similar to where the lady had once been. A second later, the heroine realized that this was the same room where Evelina met Edward Bailey in her past life. Perhaps this was also part of Daniel and Charlotte's plan. But how did they get Edward Bailey to participate? He's a member of the royal family. How could someone from the common Demi family pull off such a scam? While the lady was standing near that very room, a strange man suddenly approached her. The first thing he did was to personally ask her if Miss was the woman he needed. The guy also asked the reason why such a lovely woman as Evelina decided to be here, and all alone. Afterwards, he asked the girl what she wanted to know and warned her that his services were expensive. Without languishing for long, the heroine said that she wanted the man to find out something and promised to pay as much as it took. Then she pulled off that very precious ring and silently held it out to the knight. But this payment was not enough for the lewd man. He immediately informed her that nothing would work with such a ring. In addition, the knight noted out loud that the girl looked like she belonged to an influential family, and this was not some ordinary task with a cash prize. It instantly became clear that the unpleasant man was hinting at intimate payment. In fact, he did not want anything else in return for his work. His words, intonation, and nasty grin spoke for themselves. His gaze slid over the lady with an appraising expression, and this made everything inside go cold. "It's okay. I don't bite. Just stay still, it will be over soon," he said with a forced smile, as if trying to reassure the princess. His dirty hand was already reaching out towards the noblewoman. Fingers trembled in the air, ready to grab, to hold, to subdue. The lady understood that everything should not end like this. Now the young lady decided that she needed to kill this maniac to get out of this damn place. She had already taken out her previously prepared knife in order to inflict bodily harm as self-defense. But fortunately, the girl did not even have to do anything. Literally, a moment later, a strong male hand grabbed the bastard by the throat from behind. It was Bailey who appeared in the right place at the right moment. And again, a meeting with a handsome man literally saved the heroine's life. With all this, it was clear that Edward himself was glad to meet Mrs. Cordelia. However, the guy decided to ask the girl directly what she was doing here alone and whether the lady was planning to kill this young man. He didn't react to the lady's confession. The guy only paid attention to the fact that her hair was the color of dark cobalt. It turns out that in Frayne there is only one noblewoman with such hair, and Edward remembered this very well. In order to somehow start a conversation, the girl decided to ask about the details of the young man's life first. Evelina admitted that she had been told about how the guy was studying abroad, and so the miss decided to ask how he himself ended up here, in the small kingdom of Fran. In response, the gentleman indicated that he needed to take care of something, without revealing all the secrets. After a short conversation, the lady only expressed hope that this bodyguard would not ask about the details of her personal life. However, the girl really had nothing to worry about. The guy was not at all curious, he was not inclined to empty talk, and never asked unnecessary questions. His restraint and imperturbability seemed almost frightening, but this had its own convenience. Edward Bailey, heir to the title, next in line to the dukedom. The Duke of Bailey and Evelina's father were connected by many things. Their friendship lasted for decades, and so little Evelina was used to seeing this guy around since childhood. But then the little prince was a completely different, quieter child, as if detached from everything. The past was clearly depicted in her memory, and remembering his former self, Evelina could not help but notice the changes. Back then, he would have looked much calmer and more distant. His face rarely showed emotions, as if the world did not touch him. But time had passed, and now a completely different person stood before her. The only question is, was he the same when they met at the inn? Or had something changed? Besides, this young prince also returned much earlier than expected in his previous life. And the reason for his sudden arrival in his native kingdom was that his parents died in an accident. Now that the adult, self-sufficient man stood before Lady Evelina, he decided to ask the girl if she had money to pay, in order to find out something about the envious woman. Speaking of the female image, of course, Crown Prince Bailey was referring to the servant from the demi-kingdom, Madame Osami. But how could Bailey's son have known this at all? This blonde guy could be dangerous. Being with him had already had disastrous consequences in a past life, so Evelina knew she had to avoid anything unpredictable. But despite all that, he was the only person she could trust right now. Be that as it may, the guy has already shown himself to be the one who can bravely stand up for the lady and also calmly get the necessary information. In addition, the man himself assured that he will do almost everything for which the client only pays money. But what was the young man's surprise when, for a huge sum of money, the girl first asked him to protect her? Although usually people hire knights of a secret order to kill. As soon as the man heard this request, he couldn't even resist the urge to smile. He decided to ask the girl again if she really wanted him to be a protector and savior, who would always be on her side. But the man also said that he wasn't looking for anyone to date right now. It seemed that the guy had misunderstood the girl, so Lydia decided to clarify everything and then explain that he was not her type at all. The girl promised to give him as much as he needed and again held out her precious ring. The situation was still a little awkward, but my lady could do nothing else. She was already in a difficult situation. At the moment, the miss did not crave male attention. She only needed to be protected by a man like Edward Bailey. Evelina needed someone who would put his life on the line to protect her. And besides, perhaps the lady trusted the handsome man because he was not her type, and the young lady had known this guy since childhood, although they had not been friends before. To explain her intentions to the sir, the girl pulled at a piece of fabric on his robe. In that place, on the collar, there was a silver crescent moon depicted. This is the Order of the Shadow. And although Evelina did not have evidence of why the young man joined this organization, the lady knew that the guy counted on anonymity, and that their clients' orders were always carried out to the end. And then Miss asked him to name the person who would be best suited for her as a guard. Although it was obvious from the guy that he was already determined to become his friend's personal bodyguard. That night, Edward asked the girl to call his name whenever she was in an emergency, and then a member of the secret order would quickly appear next to her. And yet, before the young man said goodbye, the lady decided to point out that she did not remember them being friends, or even closer. The girl said this only to notice how the young man spoke to the lady without formality. "Better come when I call you, or no payment for you," Evelina shouted after the departing guy. Now the young man would really do everything that the lady's heart desires. In fact, no matter how brave and courageous this prince was, he really turned out to be a slightly strange person. Fran has many mediators, mostly specializing in secret, unresolved conflicts. However, they can do anything that is prohibited by law. The more difficult the task, the more arrogant they are. The people who made a business out of it and went underground are called the Order of the Shadow. It is an organization about which many rumors are circulating, but no one can confirm their veracity. Their activities are shrouded in secrecy, and no other group can compare to them in influence and power. And this is the same Order of Shadow that Edward Bailey is a member of. His name is rarely mentioned, but those who have ever encountered his activities know how dangerous he is. He is not just a member of the Order. He is one of those who moves its mechanisms from within, silently and efficiently. Overall, the main character of this story understood perfectly well that it was a great success to gain the support of such a determined and influential person. However, there are things that cannot be explained logically. For example, how did he know that Evelina was interested in Charlotte? And how did he understand that this was the place she would visit first? It was as if he had sold his soul to the devil to have such powers. After all, the lady had ended up in the past, and who knew what else could happen? However, the lady was not going to find out now. In any case, she could always ask Edward himself the next time they met, if she decided that she was ready to know the truth. Now the heroine faced other troubles. She was found by large guys, whose appearance did not bode well. One of the hunters, noticing her near the hut, pointed her out to the others, and then asked if the girl had seen a man who had run past her in a hurry. She had no choice but to lie that she had not noticed anything. At the same time, the Countess was told disturbing news. One of the people was found dead in the hotel. The news came from a man who ran straight out of that room. The same witness claimed that there was a woman in a hood there, and now everyone was looking for her. Since the hunters noticed that the people were clearly not going to tell the whole truth, one of the knights approached Evelina closely. He wanted to get an answer. Where did the very man they were chasing go? Only after that were they ready to leave her alone. It seemed that the critical moment had arrived when the lady had to call Edward, and she did so. As soon as the girl had loudly cried out his name, the men who had been pestering her that night decided that the one she was calling was their target. But a second passed, then another, and the figure of the bodyguard did not appear before her. At that moment, Evelina deeply regretted her stupid mistake. Did she really believe that one person from the Order of Shadow could come to her aid so easily? Now the rude hunter had already taken out a sharp axe, preparing to forcefully beat information about the fugitive's route out of her. But it couldn't end that quickly. A moment later, the fragile girl noticed the silhouette of a huge white horse emerging from the darkness. The horse rushed straight at her offenders, making them hesitate. The seemingly invulnerable men found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position. As it turned out, Edward had sent the horses to buy time. Although he had promised to appear at the girl's first call, it still took time to get to the right place. Therefore, this maneuver was his only chance to distract the pursuers. However, despite all this, Edward Bailey could not get the image of Evelina out of his head. He knew that the lady was clearly not just an innocent duchess, otherwise she would not have asked for protection. Now the young man clearly saw how all these trials changed her, turning her into a strong, seasoned woman. Besides, the young man had already given his word and agreed to this job. It seemed he simply had no choice but to continue to protect the Countess until she herself decided that she no longer needed his help. At the same time, Daniel, as usual, spent time with his mistress. The young people indulged in their passions, but as soon as everything was over, Charlotte immediately demanded that he throw out the recent guest. The maid decided not to miss the opportunity and told that this girl had recently threatened her, and even said that Charlotte would regret her rudeness. However, Daniel himself was not at all worried about such problems. He did not care at all what the stranger said. Besides, he considered Charlotte much more attractive than that girl. But the maid clearly had a personal dislike for the guest. She was openly angry, considering that she was behaving too proudly, as if she were not a commoner or a slave. Charlotte noticed that the girl seemed to be obsessed with grandeur and perhaps considered herself to be a descendant of a royal family, or someone no less noble. Although the heir of the Demi family doubted the origin of the stranger, he still noticed that she did not look like an ordinary commoner. And if she did, he would never have brought her to this house. However, the older brother did not want to discuss such nonsense now. Tired, he was going to go to bed and not think about anything. The next day, the main character took up the letter again. This time, she was not just going to send it to her father, but also to draw important conclusions for herself. If you put all the details together, then, firstly, Daniel Demi slept with Charlotte before he met Evelina. Secondly, did Count Brandy know about this fact? Thirdly, but no less importantly, Lucas, Daniel's younger brother, whom everyone thought was terminally ill, was in fact perfectly healthy. But Evelina, she died. At that moment, Charlotte burst into her room. Seeing her, the girl clutched the sheet of paper with notes and demonstratively threw it on the floor. Evelina absolutely did not want to communicate with this unpleasant person now. And besides, she did not allow anyone to enter her room without permission. Moreover, in addition to the obvious disrespect from the maid, the girl immediately noticed that Charlotte was wearing a dress that was suspiciously similar to her own. Evelina could not help but point this out. Charlotte pretended not to know who the dress belonged to. She innocently claimed that she had found the dress in a laundry room and had altered it slightly. She said that she had only taken it because she thought it belonged to no one. However, Evelina made it clear that Charlotte had taken someone else's thing. But she, not wanting to admit what she had done, immediately tried to shift the blame and blamed her. The maid sarcastically noted that it was more likely that the uninvited guest looked as if she wanted to get hold of someone else's thing. It sounded strange. At that moment, Evelina realized that Charlotte was not talking about the dress at all. She was hinting at Daniel. She believed that he belonged to her, and even this room should not be a place where Evelina felt like a mistress. But, acting like a real rude woman, Charlotte did not expect that her rival would back down so easily. Evelina only calmly stated that the dress really suited Charlotte better than her, and without even further ado, she gave it to her. This polite behavior on the part of the girl really put Daniel's lover in a dead end. She could not understand what was going on. Did this outfit really suit her so well that even her enemy was forced to admit it? But Charlotte wasn't going to think about it for long now. The only thing that mattered to her was that Evelina was a false representative of the cartel family, and she needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. The maid was eager to get rid of her, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. Meanwhile, the main character decided to get some fresh air and take a short walk around the outer grounds of the palace. Without noticing it, she found herself in the garden next to the house. This is where she walked every day after she lost her and Daniel's child. As hard as it was to remember, that very image kept popping up before Evelina's eyes. She was sitting at a table just thinking about life. It never occurred to her then that everything would turn out exactly like this. In this huge house, she had no friends left. Yes, there were bright, good-natured people here, like Sophia, but even they treated Evelina well. Not because they loved her, but only because she was Daniel's wife. What about Lucas and Lord Bailey? Did they know what Daniel was planning? Or were they themselves involved in this plot? No one could answer all the questions that tormented her now. While she was sitting at the table, she overheard a conversation between several maids. One of them worriedly reported that the cellars were empty, and this could lead to big problems. The girls discussed how the family would most likely go bankrupt soon. One of them even heard that his lordship had recently invested in some important business, and this money was supposed to return to him 100-fold. As soon as Evelina heard this, she thought, perhaps all the money was invested in oil production, which will only start to bring profit in 2 years. In the past life, that was when the Cordelia family also received huge money. In addition, she overheard the maids talking about mysterious flaming stones from a neighboring country. It turns out that some swindlers were using oil in their scams. They built a plant in a place where there was no oil and convinced everyone that they were extracting something completely unique. Once, in her first life, Evelina had already heard about this and even discussed the situation with her father. At that time, she sincerely regretted the victims of this deception. The father, in turn, only smiled and noted what a wise and caring daughter he had raised. He had always dreamed of such a reliable and intelligent woman joining their family. Now, analyzing the behavior of those around her in her past life, Evelina guessed that Bailey could have been involved in this scam too. Perhaps he was interested not only in their money, but also in the family's situation. Perhaps that was why he had arranged for his daughter to marry Daniel, to cover the huge debts they had accumulated. It just so happened that Evelina had no friends now. If something happened to her, there was no one to help her. Or would Edward have helped her? Even if he hadn't been there yesterday. Evelina had actually expected this to happen, but for some reason she still felt a headache. Maybe she wanted to believe that only Daniel and Charlotte were devoted to her. If you think about it, it would be more correct to ask, who was devoted to Evelina in the first place? Who knows more? At least where they are. While the girl was suffering from all this complexity and injustice of life, Lucas quietly approached her. The guy decided to inquire about her well-being, since it seemed to him that the lady looked exhausted and felt bad. At that moment, as soon as their eyes met, Evelina suddenly realized Lucas had not been loyal to her in his past life. He had died before they met, but that was the strangest part. In 6 months, the girl was supposed to marry Daniel, and by that time, Lucas was already gone. But the Lucas she saw now looked perfectly healthy. Lost in her thoughts, Evelina did not support the conversation, and their conversation did not go well. Then, to diffuse the situation, Lucas suddenly asked the girl if she liked the sea. Having received a positive answer, the young man suggested going on a picnic along the coast. It was a great opportunity to be alone together, which is exactly what Evelina wanted. Such chances were rare. The perfect time for a frank conversation without outsiders. Meanwhile, Charlotte was furiously destroying her rival's dress in a fit of rage. She was so angry after her encounter with Evelina that she could think of nothing but revenge. The girl understood. She needed to find Evelina's weak spot as soon as possible, or create one herself. The maid knew that if Daniel sided with his rival, she would be finished. At that moment, the young lady accidentally ran into Dick, Daniel's groom. The guy spoke to her first, since the girl was blocking his way. Before demanding that she leave, the man asked her what was bothering her so much. He even offered to help. But Charlotte did not want this young man's help at all. She did not believe that he was capable of doing anything at all. The girl advised him to return to his duties and take up herding. However, as she was leaving the barn, she noticed Sophia nearby in the company of an unknown man. At that moment, Charlotte thought they were flirting, and a new plan immediately formed in her head. She turned to Dick, gently touched his cheek, and asked him again in a sweet voice if he would like to do something for her. Meanwhile, Lucas insistently continued to invite Evelina to have breakfast with him. He told her that there was a beach nearby that was famous for its picturesque views. It was called Grasshopper Beach, and Daniel's younger brother was sure that the girl would like it. In fact, Cordelia already knew this place well. In her past life, she had been there many times, together with Daniel. It really was an incredibly beautiful and picturesque place. Unfortunately, it turned out that the girl could not immediately give Lucas a clear answer. Their conversation was unexpectedly interrupted by the older brother. Daniel did not even hide his indignation that Lucas was talking to a woman he did not like. And when he learned that Lady Evelina was relaxing in the garden, and his brother had just happened to join her, his irritation only increased. The Crown Prince advised the girl not to wander around, as he did not want his father to see her. In his opinion, her lies had already gone too far. He also asked Lucas not to do anything stupid. It was obvious that there was tension between the brothers. Evelina had not known this the last time they had met at the table, and now she was somewhat upset. When the rude man finally left, Lucas apologized for his behavior and noted that his brother was having a bad day. The guy explained that Daniel had just returned from taking care of his father's business, so it was no wonder he was in a bad mood. As soon as Lucas spoke, the girl decided to ask him when Lord Bailey was expected to return. In response, the friend asked the lady not to worry about Daniel's words and simply forget everything he had said earlier. Then he added that Bailey was currently on a long trip and would not return soon. In addition, Lucas promised that even if Daniel was right, he would try to soften their father's anger, preventing him from making hasty decisions. That day, Lucas admitted that he trusted Evelina and considered her to be who she claimed to be. The girl wondered why. After all, he had as many reasons to suspect her as Daniel did. In fact, Lucas had no particular reason to trust her. Just his gut instinct told him that the lady could not be a liar. It turned out that Sophia had told him about the letter, and Lucas didn't think Daniel would know about it. Besides that, there was another detail he couldn't ignore. Evelina reminded him of their late mother. The Duchess mother died many years ago due to a serious illness. There were rumors that Lucas had the same disease because it is hereditary. However, Evelina now began to have serious doubts about this. To finally sort things out, the lady decided to ask Lucas directly where the Duchess was now. The young man froze for a moment and then sadly replied that his mother had died in childhood, when he was very little. But the plague is not hereditary. If the Duchess died of this disease, then Lucas could not have inherited it, and someone simply lied to him. To change the subject, the guy decided to return to the question of the picnic, since he still hadn't received a clear answer from the lady. Evelina initially apologized, explaining that she was too worried about Daniel's words and needed some time to recover. However, if she felt better tomorrow, she promised to go to the beach with Lucas. When night fell, dark thoughts kept Evelina awake. This time she was thinking about Lucas's death and was sure that there was something hidden behind it. Now she was determined that she needed to get to know this guy better. While she was wandering around the palace, she suddenly ran into a groom. Dick stopped her and told her urgent news. An unknown man had appeared in the palace during the day. The boy said that the man had claimed that the letter the miss had sent to Lord Cordelia had been intercepted by bandits. So the palace servant suggested that the girl should meet the man in person to find out more details. It sounded strange, but perhaps it was simpler than it seemed. It soon became clear that the letter had ended up in the hands of Bailey, her personal bodyguard. Edward carefully studied the lady's note and came to the conclusion that the girl knew how to act, but she lacked experience. Sometimes her actions even seemed careless to him. Bailey's assistant added that the people who stole the letter were most likely not connected to Daniel. They were ordinary thieves pursuing their own interests, nothing more. Edward noticed how much had befallen Evelina since she had arrived here. It seemed that her luck had turned against her, and her problems were only piling up. When the assistant had listened to his master, he asked him a direct question. Had the lady already begun to seduce him? In his opinion, the boss was too interested in this woman, but Edward cut Noel off abruptly, declaring that he had no intention of listening to such nonsense. Well, the most important thing is that now they remember the faces of those who stole the letter. All that remains is to return it to Cordelia. Edward assigned Kendrick to handle the letter, while Noel was to keep an eye on security. He himself also went about his business, experiencing a strange presentiment. The lady might need him. Meanwhile, Evelina was confused. The letter had been intercepted by bandits. She blamed herself for this because she should have foreseen such a possibility. Daniel Fran's feudal lords were becoming more and more dangerous, and the brokers no longer had a moment's peace. There was no guarantee that the letter would reach home intact. Even more frightening was the thought that the bandits might be connected to Daniel. To find out everything for sure, the girl asked the young man if he had delivered the letter alone. Now it was important for her to find out all the details. What had happened and who had taken possession of the note. The envoy admitted that he lacked the eloquence to explain everything in detail, so he prepared several sketches, hoping that they would help the lady understand the situation better. He unfolded a sheet of paper and began to show the drawings. But before Evelina had time to examine the drawings, the young man pushed her sharply towards the cliff. The girl involuntarily flew down at a furious speed. How could she be so stupid? She had just blamed herself for her short-sightedness. Why didn't Evelina understand that it was a simple trap? The lady's thoughts were gaining more and more gloomy turns, because now she was literally dying. But at that moment, the girl remembered Edward. Earlier, he had asked her to call him by name when she needed him. Without wasting a second, the lady loudly shouted his name. She closed her eyes in fear, not wanting to see death again. And when she looked back, she was no longer on a horse, with Edward holding her by the waist. Luckily, Edward, as promised, showed up at the right moment. The situation was tense, but despite this, the guy even managed to joke. He grinned and said that he had flown in only because he liked the ring the girl had left as collateral. Such an unexpected comment distracted the lady from the horror she had experienced for a second. At that moment, Bailey noticed the man who had thrown the girl down. He was still standing on the platform, watching them. His posture seemed relaxed, but he could attack again at any moment. So Bailey motioned to the lady not to move or provoke the attacker. It was worth waiting for the right moment before doing anything. Evelina was indescribably grateful to her savior, even though she had paid for his work. However, if she continued to act so recklessly, one ring would soon not be enough. However, she could think about that later. Right now, it was more important to make sure that the danger had passed. Edward brought more good news. They had the letter the lady had been desperately looking for. He said that the assistants had taken it from the bandits who had tried to use it for their own purposes. Now the message was on its way back to the Cordelia family. However, before saying goodbye, Bailey decided to give Evelina some important advice. He emphasized that the ability to think quickly and make decisions is a useful skill, but sometimes she is too hasty and does not see the whole picture. The girl would not have made a mistake if she had thought it through properly. But at the same time, if she had at least one friend with whom she could walk at night, this would not have happened. Then Edward, as if nothing had happened, changed the subject and asked how much Evelina liked the sword. During their last meeting, she had only had a dagger. The girl, with some confusion, replied that she knew how to handle a weapon, but only in general terms. The young lady explained that the weapon was needed for self-defense, and she thought that the maniacs would be scared when they saw it in her hands. But without even listening to the girl, Edward took out his sword to give it to her. He showed the strongest part of the ball. You could stretch out your hand and thrust it forward, then the weapon would easily pierce the chest. The girl had to try to make this movement to understand how to handle such a weapon. Of course, no self-respecting lady carries a sword, but in her situation, it could really become a necessity. And therefore, training would be very useful. Cordelia was smart enough to manage the family's affairs, but she really needed a good teacher in the art of combat. And it seemed that Bailey could become one. The girl gratefully accepted the sword, realizing that this lesson could save her life. Before finally saying goodbye to each other, the guy advised the girl to never lose her vigilance and quickly disappeared from sight on his white horse. That same night, the prince, the main heir of the Demi family, was simply furious that he had only now learned about the contents of Evelina's letter. First of all, he shouted at Sophia, who had not told him this information in the first place. The maid explained that she had told everything to Lord Lucas since Daniel was absent, but this only angered the master even more. For some reason, Daniel decided that Sophia had told Lucas everything only because she thought it would be better if he inherited the duchy. And no matter how much Sophia tried to deny it, pointing out that Lord Brandy had made his eldest son his successor, the young man still could not stop being angry. At that moment, the heir began to think. When he first heard that the woman was going to send a letter, he was sure that it contained a request for help from her accomplices. But if it was in fact a letter to Sir Cordelia, as Sophia claimed, then everything began to fit together. Was it possible that the mysterious intruder really was Evelina Cordelia? If so, it would explain a lot. Perhaps the young man considered this turn of events to be even better. Now he was sure that such a woman would find a way to prove herself, and that meant he should closely monitor her further actions. While Daniel was pondering what was happening, Evelina was still near the castle. She and Edward lingered for a while, continuing to discuss what had happened. Bailey kept reminding the girl that she needed to be careful, and she just nodded, admitting that she was indeed trying to be on guard. However, she was still too short-sighted in this matter. Or rather, the girl was so short-sighted that she didn't even notice when Edward switched to a familiar tone again. Their conversation dragged on a bit, because they still had a little time before dawn, and they decided to practice. After all, Bailey had to leave in the morning, and the lady had to return to the palace. Why did they wait for the sun to rise? The answer is quite simple. Edward Bailey has to protect Evelina. The guy just couldn't leave the girl alone in the dark. Besides, the same guy who pushed the lady is wandering around somewhere. A couple of hours later, the guys continued their training, but now they got closer to Demi's castle. Edward brought the girl to a special entrance where she should not be caught, since few people go there. Before letting the lady go to the palace, he advised her to rest a little, because the lady fell many times when they were training. In addition, the knight noticed that the girl had become physically stronger and more resilient. And rest is not an integral part for the owner of the ball. The most important thing is that today ended well. And Evelina returned just in time while everyone is busy now. If she can sneak into her room now and remain unnoticed, that will be just fine. When the girl was already approaching her room, she nevertheless ran into an unpleasant young lady. Charlotte was passing by in the corridor. The first thing the girl noticed was that the maid had gotten up quite early and decided to go and see what she was doing here now. The maid looked unwell, as if she had just seen a ghost. Evelina noted this out loud with a smile, which caused Charlotte to burst into a fit of irritation. Besides, the courage of the uninvited guest really looked like something unreal, as if Evelina was talking in her sleep. Then Charlotte said that she was only busy with her work here. The heroine would think about this dialogue for a long time and painfully. Be that as it may, the reborn Evelina will never be able to forgive Charlotte for what she did to her in the future. But now she is just a servant tormented by envy. In general, Cordelia could even understand her. But still, the maid crossed the line. In order not to continue the conflict, that evening the girl said that she simply thought that the maid was checking whether there was a temporary resident in their palace. Evelina decided not to develop the topic further because she was tired. However, her calmness did not mean weakness. Rather, it was an unwillingness to waste energy on a person who had already proven his meanness. It was a certain trick to slap her on the cheek. Going to extremes, hitting the girl with all her might, Evelina did not regret it at all. Cordelia knew very well that such an act would have consequences, but now she did not care. She was tired of enduring the antics of an envious servant who did not disdain the lowest methods to get rid of her. Charlotte was indescribably horrified by the guest's actions. How dared she raise her hand against the staff of the palace where she was given shelter? Evelina explained that this assault was nothing compared to what Charlotte herself had done. The maid's hypocrisy was astounding because she dared to be indignant despite all her attempts to harm Evelina. Evelina's inaction could not be mistaken for weakness. If this happened again, Princess Cordelia would not just stand there. She was no longer going to play the silent game with her. Any further attempt to harm her would be stopped immediately, and the consequences for her offenders would be far more serious than a slap. When the offender left, the groom followed Charlotte. He came to the maid to explain that he had done everything as she had asked yesterday. However, seeing the expression on Charlotte's face, he realized that something had gone wrong. The maid was furious because her plan had failed, and Evelina continued to walk around alive and unharmed. Everything went completely wrong for the embittered miss, because Evelina was now safe and sound. As soon as the maid began to complain about Dick's unprofessionalism, saying that he couldn't do anything with an ordinary girl, the guy was extremely surprised. After all, he himself saw how the mercenary he hired pushed her into a ravine. Everything should have ended differently. But Charlotte didn't want to hear any excuses at that moment. Her plan had been ruined, and now the girl wanted only one thing: to be alone. She couldn't believe that everything had turned out this way. Her anger and despair mixed together, forcing her to look for a new way to get rid of Evelina. But for now, she could only digest her failure. The next morning, the letter finally arrived at the Cordelia estate. How happy the father was to receive the news that his daughter was alive. Just recently, he thought that he had lost her forever. And now, holding the letter in his hands, he could not contain his excitement. He urgently needed to see her, to make sure that she was really safe. He immediately called the crew to move to the neighboring mansion. Even though Cordelia was supposed to have a meeting with important guests today, the man insistently decided to leave for Demi's house as soon as possible. His daughter was waiting for him there, and nothing could be more important than that. Even if his absence raised questions, the father was ready to risk his reputation for the sake of the family. That same morning, Edward also heard rumors that Sir Connor had received a letter. This meant that Kendrick had carried out his lord's order. Now everything depended on how soon Sir Cordelia would get to his daughter. Edward knew that until that moment, the girl would have to endure in dangerous surroundings. It was only hoped that Evelina would hold out while her father made his way to Demi. Edward knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that the lady wasn't one to give up easily. However, even her strength might not be enough if the odds turned against her again. At that moment, Kendrick decided to ask his boss about what had made him think. When Edward went to see the lady last night, he could have helped her escape. The assistant sincerely did not understand why the team allowed the girl to return, if it was so dangerous there. But Edward had a clear answer to this. Letting her go free swimming was even more dangerous. Daniel must prove himself to Lord Brandy. This means he must show his independence and ensure the safety of the family estate. He will want to keep the stranger until his father arrives. The lady will want to return to the estate herself, because she still has unfinished business here. This is indeed correct, because the girl herself knew that she still needed to do something here. Now, Evelina should have waited for her father to arrive. The Dark Order also needs to follow its course to catch the guy, which means that everything that is happening so far fits into the logic of events. Lucas decided to join her. The first thing the guy noticed was that the girl looked tired. It was obvious that she had a hard time calling this place her home. In fact, Evelina hadn't slept a wink the night before. Too much had happened in the last few days. The girl was executed. She went back in time, learned about Daniel and Charlotte, survived Charlotte's assassination attempt, and met Edward. It all seemed so incredible that sometimes Evelina herself couldn't believe that this was really her life. What this Edward knows is completely unclear. It seems that he does not even suspect Evelina of anything, but at the same time, it is clear from him that he is not indifferent to her. However, it seems that he knows much more than he says. At that moment, the girl was so deep in thought that she didn't even hear the guy's question. He asked something, but her mind was too busy thinking to catch the meaning of the words. Lucas decided to lighten the mood a little and asked if the young lady was thinking about her lover, as she was sitting at the table too intently. But Evelina was forced to admit that she currently had no lover. But Lucas thought she couldn't be sure since she had lost her memory. He assumed she had a loved one she had forgotten about. It was just an assumption, without any malicious intent. And this time, the boys' conversation was interrupted again by Demi's eldest son. Seeing them together, he asked Lucas not to play such games with the girl, because it could make her feel uncomfortable. Deciding to join the meal, he sat down next to the new inhabitant of the palace and first of all asked how she was feeling and whether she had slept well that night. The guy also asked if she liked the breakfast and even suggested asking the cook to cook something else. It's strange that his attitude towards Evelina changed so abruptly. Besides, there was a distinct sense of rivalry between the brothers. As soon as Daniel sat down at the table, Lucas gently asked him to leave Evelina alone and let her have breakfast in private. But the gentleman only asked the lady's permission to go away with Lucas for a chat. As soon as they were alone, Daniel asked his brother if he had fallen in love with this girl. It would seem, why is this so important for the crown prince? But he explained that he must know everything that happens in their lands. Lucas admitted that he did not think he was in love with Evelina, but he thought she was charming and elegant. His older brother just smirked, considering him empty and vain, and therefore unworthy of the title of Duke. Then Daniel reminded him that Cordelia was in charge of the biggest deals in Fran. If Evelina was really one of them, she would have to be his older brother's wife. Lucas was thinking about marrying the girl he liked, but soon decided to ask her about Charlotte. Who would have thought that the maid would be nearby at that very moment? And although the heroine had such a wonderful chance to listen to Daniel's opinion and plans for her, the older brother was not going to just wag his tongue and only avoided answering. Only after a long pause did Daniel notice why Lucas was incapable of becoming the heir to the estate. The younger member of the family seemed like a fool who did not even realize that Charlotte was just a toy used by the master. That day, Daniel asked his brother to forget about Lady Evelina, because their father would still bring her together with the eldest son. When Daniel decided to return to his chambers, he unexpectedly met Charlotte. She was waiting for him near the bedroom to ask the master something. Of course, the girl wanted to express her indignation about Daniel's potential marriage to a stranger who had recently arrived to their palace. But in response, the man only raised his voice, demanding that he watch his words. He could argue that even if Evelina was not Cordelia, she was still higher than an ordinary maid. Even if that's true, she'll still have to face the consequences of her lies. But first, Daniel is determined to find out what kind of family she really comes from. How hurt Charlotte was. After all, her lover had previously assured her that he would one day make her more than just a servant. She had sincerely believed him, but now these promises seemed empty. Even during a serious conversation, the guy was not going to listen to Charlotte's complaints. He simply ignored her words and continued talking to Evelina, as if the maid was a nobody. At this point, Evelina suddenly confessed that Charlotte had done a lot of good for her, despite her lowly position. She told how she had gotten out of bed at night to take care of her. But before the girl could say a few words, Daniel interrupted her with a loud laugh. Then he noticed that the guests seemed to have already gotten used to their house and felt quite comfortable. This again brought him back to the proposal he was about to make. The eldest heir of the House of Demi admitted that he was preparing a special reception for an important guest. He wanted to throw a banquet in honor of Evelina Cordelia's visit, a kind of welcome party to get to know the girl better. Now all that was left was to ask Lady Evelina's opinion about the organization of the event. In fact, that's exactly what the guy did. And for the first time in all that time, he called her by her royal name, which she had introduced herself with at their first meeting. First of all, the girl did not expect that he would suddenly ask her opinion so formally. Therefore, she immediately asked a direct question. Why such unexpected respect? It really did seem unexpected, that's all. After all, the girl knew that no one in this kingdom trusted her yet. To show his best side, Daniel decided to apologize. He explained that in his father's absence, he had to take on too many responsibilities. He admitted that he had previously behaved rudely for the sake of everyone's safety. But could a man who threatened her with a sword be forgiven? When Evelina asked why he had changed his mind so abruptly, the guy suddenly declared that he had fallen in love with her at first sight. Daniel dropped to one knee, took her hand gently, and began to speak admiringly of her bravery in protecting the child from the maddened horse instead of running away. The guy continued to talk about how that moment wouldn't leave his mind, like he couldn't hide his feelings anymore and had to admit them. That I was able to save you that day makes me the happiest, Daniel continued. The only irony is that he didn't save her then. The real hero turned out to be Edward. It was he who came to the girl's aid. Daniel was still kneeling, looking at her intently. He asked her if she had any hard feelings towards him for threatening her with a sword earlier. The guy didn't try to justify himself. He just explained that he was forced to be careful. He had no choice because in front of him stood a stranger who called herself Connor's dead daughter Cordelia. But at that moment, the girl's thoughts were occupied with something else. She remembered how Edward had been the first to call her Evelyn Cordelia that day, and the very fact that she was alive somehow didn't surprise him then. What did this man really know? Daniel continued to persuade her to leave the past behind and allow him to throw a banquet in her honor. The lady had no choice but to politely agree. She had to say that she had forgotten that day and was even grateful to the Demerel family for their hospitality. Now Evelina was forced to say that she was looking forward to the party. Already in the evening, many guests had gathered in Demi's royal mansion. Many of them were sincerely amazed that the real Evelina Cordelia was standing in front of them. One of the young men even approached the lady to say how he wanted to collaborate with her in the future. But now was not the time for business negotiations. Even Daniel understood this, so he helped the girl politely refuse overly persistent guests. Lucas, who was standing nearby, noticed how many people wanted to talk to Evelina. But so far, everything was fine. The girl did not look tired, and such parties are always noisy. She understood the situation. After all, before all these people thought she was dead, and now they saw her alive and well. Later, when Evelina was alone with Lucas, she decided to ask him a question. She wondered if he doubted her words when she introduced herself as Evelina Cordelia. After all, the dead do not return. But Lucas only repeated his opinion. She didn't look like a liar. And besides, he hadn't seen her body with his own eyes. Perhaps someone could have passed themselves off as dead. Perhaps someone thought dead is actually alive. Daniel believes in the past, and Lucas believes in the present. But even he has noticed that his older brother has changed his attitude. It was the perfect moment to ask Lucas about his relationship with Daniel, since the girl initially thought that the brothers did not get along. But Lucas just smiled and said that it might seem that way from the outside. In reality, they were brothers just like everyone else. At the same time, it was clear from Lucas that Daniel had turned against him when his father spoke about the succession. It turns out that this is still an unresolved issue. Evelina thought, naturally, that Lord Daniel would be the successor. And in fact, everyone in the house thinks so, even his father. If it weren't for his mother's request, Daniel would have already taken his position. However, now that he had to wait, he felt that this waiting only made the situation worse. His nerves were strained to the limit, because the guy knew that his time would come sooner or later, and then he would make all the decisions on his own without anyone's interference. That evening, Evelina Cordelia learned that it was the brother's mother who asked to protect Lucas. This was truly a new discovery for the reincarnated girl. She could not understand why the mother of the family wanted her youngest son to be safe. In the future from which Evelina came, Lucas died of the same genetic disease as his mother. However, in this life, he told her that his mother had died of the plague. The stories did not intersect, which meant that something had changed. Someone as upright as Lucas could become a hindrance to Daniel? Perhaps this is why his older brother decided to take care of him when he received the dukedom. If so, then one fears for the fate of the younger heir. What if the dead body that the girl mistook for Daniel's was actually Lucas's? This thought haunted her. What if at the moment when Evelina thought she had taken revenge on her enemy, another person had actually died? Everything was becoming too confusing, and now the girl was beginning to doubt her previous assumptions. And perhaps Daniel had never allowed Evelina to meet Lucas, so that she wouldn't suspect anything when the time came. After all, if she had seen him earlier, she might have guessed that there was another hidden side to this story. Now the girl began to doubt whether her entire path had been planned in advance by someone who remained in the shadows. A little later, Evelina decided to ask her friend a question. She was interested to know what he himself thought about what Daniel would do first if he became the head of the family. Perhaps this answer contained a clue that would help her understand the current situation. Lucas's wish turned out to be completely harmless. The boy wanted to travel outside the duchy. He had never had such an opportunity, unlike his father and brother. He wanted to see the world and visit beautiful places. He dreamed of not only exploring the unknown, but also doing something that would truly bring him pleasure. However, for now, Lucas preferred to keep his true passion a secret. He was not ready to share it with anyone else, perhaps because he was afraid of judgment or simply did not want his dream to become the property of others. Now, Evelina was looking forward to the moment when her new friend would be able to tell her about his hobby. It seemed that the party was going much better than the girl had imagined. Everything was going smoothly. However, before she and Lucas could talk for a long time, the situation changed dramatically and everything started to go completely wrong. The conversation between Evelina and Lucas was interrupted by a loud, questioning exclamation from the owner of the estate. The girl turned around and saw one of the commoners confidently declaring that the beauty was not Evelina Cordelia at all. The stranger swore that he had worked for her family for some time and had personally seen the real daughter of the Marquis. According to him, she looked completely different. At the same time, King Daniel was talking to a member of the secret squad. The man expressed his condolences on the death of Marquis Cordelia, as his daughter had just come of age. In fact, He wanted to introduce the girl to his son, Daniel, as he saw it as a fortunate coincidence. Edward even grinned slightly at this point. The young man had something to say on this topic, and some of what he knew might seem very curious to his interlocutor. It seemed that just a minute ago, everyone around was having fun, talking and laughing, and now the atmosphere had become tense. But how quickly everything changed when one of the guests suddenly announced that this girl was not, in fact, Evelina Cordelia. The question of who she was then hung in the air. What family was she from? Frankly, Daniel didn't care where she came from. What bothered him more was that she was lying. Before confirming or denying her origins, the lady decided to personally speak with the person who made the accusation. It turned out that the man was a seafood trader. His organization was responsible for supplying fish to the estate. The girl then demanded that he explain how exactly their work was organized, where he went to get the goods, who he passed the reports to, how the deliveries were controlled. She was not going to leave room for lies, insisting that the man tell everything in the smallest detail. However, it was obvious from his reaction that he had not expected this turn of events. He swallowed nervously, casting quick glances at the people gathered around him, as if hoping to find an ally among them. His hands began to tremble and his lips pressed into a thin line. The man tried to speak, but no coherent sentence came out. Evelina then pointed out the obvious. He couldn't answer any of her questions. Cordelia was dozens of times bigger than this place, and the warehouse is located separately from the main house. None of the merchants have free access to its territory, which means that a simple worker will not be able to just stroll around the royal estate and accidentally stumble upon the marquise's daughter. Now the man's lie was obvious to everyone. His version of events simply did not hold water. If he really worked for the royal family, he would never have seen the face of the count's daughter. After all, her safety was always a top priority, and outsiders were forbidden to appear near the family quarters. But despite the obviousness of his lies, the merchant continued to wriggle out of it, coming up with new excuses. He began to say that he often wandered nearby, hoping to one day see the face of the king's daughter. However, this statement sounded even more suspicious. After all, his main job was to check the freshness of perishable goods, not to wait for aristocrats in the hope of meeting one of them. However, even under pressure, he stubbornly continued to insist that it was not Evelina Cordelia standing before them. Lord Daniel watched in silence, but even to him the situation looked extremely suspicious. He did not like this woman or her behavior. Yes, he believed the letter she had sent to the estate and her words. But did that mean she had been honest from the start? That was an open question. Besides, the guy hadn't forgotten that humiliating moment when this girl had forced him to kneel before her. There was something bold in her character, and it irritated him. Why should he back down and let her continue her game just because she was a woman? The situation was becoming increasingly tense. At this point, the younger brother intervened in the conversation. Lucas looked at Daniel and calmly pointed out that they could not solve this problem on their own. Perhaps it was worth waiting for their father to return. However, Daniel immediately rejected this proposal. He was sure that Lucas was wrong. After all, while their father was away, it was he, Daniel, who had to make all the decisions. And that meant he would decide the fate of this girl himself. Finally, without thinking twice, the first heir of the demi-kingdom ordered the palace staff to take the lady to the dungeon as quickly as possible in a cold, confident voice. At the same time, his face remained impassive, as if he had already made the final verdict. According to his plan, she was to be executed in the morning. Although the girl herself could not stand the prince's decision, all she decided to say was that Sir Cordelia would soon arrive, and the prince would regret this decision. In turn, Lucas only looked with pity as the girl was taken by force. After the event ended, albeit not on the most pleasant note, Charlotte handed over a bag of money as payment for that very merchant. Lady Osami was indescribably pleased that they had caught the swindler thanks to the man's testimony. The girl was sure that the Lord would be very grateful. But the hired man himself was afraid that Sir Cordelia was still firm in his decision. Then everyone would know that he was lying. Despite all this, Charlotte continued to assure those around her that this girl was a liar. She did not allow a drop of doubt in her rightness. In order not to waste time, the girl only briefly assured him that he would be released in the morning. After that, she said goodbye sweetly and with a light voice walked away, as if everything that was happening only made her happy. Indeed, Lady Osami's joy that evening was indescribable. A pleasant warmth spread through her chest from the thought that her opponent had finally found herself trapped. The only thing that puzzled Charlotte a little was why she hadn't thought of this before. Everything turned out to be so simple and effective that the girl even admired her own ingenuity. Charlotte watched as the intruder, her hands tied behind her back, was roughly led toward the dungeon. This was the most pleasant sight for her all evening. Evelina had to walk forward, stumbling over the unevenness of the road. However, no one was going to spare her. But even in this situation, Evelina was not going to show her weakness. She kept her composure and asked in a calm, confident voice to loosen the ropes a little. She did not try to escape. In such a dress, it would have been impossible. But the bonds cut too hard into her wrists, causing pain, and she saw no point in enduring it in silence. One of the guards looked at her carefully. He noticed how the red marks from the rough ropes had already appeared on her skin. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to loosen the knot. After all, even if the captive tried to escape, she would not succeed. The long dress would not allow her to move quickly, and the guards were not going to let down their guard. With a heavy sigh, the guard carefully loosened the knot, allowing the girl to move her arms a little more freely. At that moment, no one knew what was going on in Evelina's head. Even tied up and surrounded by enemies, she did not look broken. Perhaps she had something in mind. A second later, taking advantage of the moment when the guard loosened his grip, the lady deftly knocked the sword away from the guard with her hand and quickly struck the guy in the chest. The tip of the blade pierced the soldier's chest without hesitation, and he didn't even have time to realize what had happened. The dull sound of the blow echoed in the silence, followed by a groan of pain. With one of the guards down, Evelina could literally control the situation as she wished. Now she raised her sword and indicated that the soldiers would have to walk a little to call for backup. She was actually waiting for some to leave the guards. "Right now, if you want to live, run," the girl said, explaining that she didn't want to harm innocent people. She didn't see the point in fighting people who were simply following orders. Naturally, the boys immediately ran off toward the forest. Evelina herself could not fully comprehend how she had managed to defeat one of the guards so easily. Her heart was pounding in her chest, beating so fast that it seemed like it would burst out. In another situation, she might have thought about what she had done. But not now. Now she had to get out of here alive. Now the main character of this story really needed to think seriously about what she should do. If she ran away now, at least she wouldn't have to worry about the girl being executed tomorrow. But what would happen next? The father must be in a hurry to save his daughter. The lady simply couldn't leave now. Maybe the girl should hide until he arrived. But where? At that very moment, fortunately, Milady remembered one place in the estate that was ideal for this. Besides, Daniel was too stupid to guess that the girl might be there. No one would find the lady there with certainty. Evelina would be completely safe, hidden until her father arrived. At least now she could breathe a little easier. At the same time, she still had to stay alert. Whatever the case, the girl still believed that she would definitely survive. Meanwhile, the same soldiers who brought the girl into the dungeon did not know what to do with the body of that guard. The lady stabbed the guard, but he was not dead yet. He will die only if the guys leave him alone in the forest. And what happens if the boys just run away? Lady Cordelia will have to pay for her sins with her life. One of the guys reminded that the guy the girl had injured was a scary duke. The lady could even be executed for that. But if the friend couldn't be saved, then there was nothing wrong with that, since they wouldn't be able to do anything themselves. And yet the soldier insisted that they had to return to their brother in command. If the lady died, they would never be able to get the information they needed, and all their plans would collapse. The friend agreed with the knight and decided to return to save the guard. Now Kendrick should keep an eye on the lady. Although the girl hid so well that finding her would be another quest, the young lady decided that she would hide somewhere here, in Demi's dungeon. This place is so spacious and large that overall it really is easy to hide there. Meanwhile, the silhouette of a young man approached the bloody pool of the murdered guard. The guy touched the blood with his finger and then decided to taste it. "Excellent. I like it very much, Lady Evelina Cordelia," the dark silhouette said that night. Demi's father was already returning from his trip right after he heard the news about Miss Evelina. It so happened that he was riding in the same carriage with Lord Cordelia. The first thing the king did was thank his acquaintance for the care their house had given his daughter and even asked how he could pay for it. But the eldest of the demi-clan pointed out that it was not he who took care of Evelina, but his son. To be honest, the master was a little worried when he left the estate to Daniel alone. But it seemed to the man that the young boy had done a much better job than he could have imagined. As the carriage rolled smoothly along the road, the men were silent, each lost in his own thoughts. However, Connor couldn't help but ask, why was this blonde man riding with them? He had noticed his presence long ago, but until now, he didn't know what role he was playing and what was happening. The person in question was Edward Bailey, who was not inside the carriage but riding alongside on his black horse. He held himself confidently despite the speed at which the carriages were moving. His gaze was focused, and his posture suggested that he was ready to act at any moment. In fact, Mr. Demi had brought Edward along for a reason. It was this guy who had first given him the information about the lady, which had caused his quick return. If that hadn't happened, he might not be sitting here with Lord Cordelia now. Discussing the imminent return to the capital, Connor noticed that his interlocutor was completely sure that his daughter Cordelia was alive. However, the man could not understand where he got such confidence from. He himself still did not know how to cope with this oppressive excitement. Meanwhile, in Demi's palace, the young people were discussing the results of the evening. The groom was so shocked by the events that he began to believe in something supernatural. It seemed that he seriously decided that the mysterious girl was not a person, but a ghost. Of course, it was all nonsense. One of the boys explained that the lady had simply killed the guard and fled. But Dick considered this assumption even more senseless, since he did not know how a girl could attack a trained guard. But several days had passed and she had not yet been caught, which is why the groom considered her a ghost and did not want to listen to other explanations. Charlotte, who had been trying to quietly eavesdrop on the conversation and all the thoughts of other people on this matter, only responded to the suggestion of other people with a smirk. It seemed that the girl was happy with the mere fact that her plan worked as she had planned. At the same time, at the other end of the house, Demi and her brother were also sipping tea, discussing the latest events. The eldest son, raising his eyebrows in surprise, could not understand how the best guards of the royal territory still could not catch this girl. After all, such experienced guards could not cope with one young girl. Seeing his brother with obvious displeasure continue the conversation about the mysterious girl, Daniel could not hold back his irony. He noticed that Lucas still believed this fraud and did not even doubt her innocence. All this surprised him, but he could not help but express his doubts. To justify his position, the brother tried to convince Daniel that they had never seen the guard's body. In his opinion, this could mean that everything that was happening was nothing more than a misunderstanding. Lucas believed that perhaps the lady had extenuating circumstances and he would like to hear the whole truth directly from her. However, the brother was categorical in his opinion. Daniel was not going to show any kindness or tolerance towards this girl. On the contrary, he was sure that they needed to get rid of her as soon as possible. Lucas had to take part in the search for her as well, and before their father arrived, they had to take care of all these matters. Literally a couple of minutes later, the brothers learned that they hadn't made it. The palace assistant entered the room with the message that Lord Brandy had returned. As soon as their father entered the room, he first praised Daniel, but the man immediately noticed that something was wrong here today. He immediately decided to ask his eldest son what had happened here. At that moment, it was as if the ground had slipped from under Daniel's feet. It seemed that the boy had not expected to see his father so early. Dad had already arrived, and they had not yet had time to sort out the girl. At the same time, of course, the young man did not want to admit it. That is why he told his father that nothing terrible had happened and everything was fine. But the next question from the father was exactly where Evelina was now. Brandy asked not to be modest in front of him. And then the father praised the eldest son and noted that the boy did everything right. Then Brandy said that Sir Cordelia had arrived to express his gratitude. Now he is in the portrait room, so Dad asked to take Lady Evelina there too. At that moment, the young man's throat seemed to dry up. He still managed to tell his father that this girl was a fraud. But literally, a second later, one of the palace employees also reported that all the guards had found the girl and that she was in the dungeon. Now that everyone had come to the dungeon to see this fraud, the girl greeted Lord Brandy with restraint and respect. She introduced herself as the daughter and only child of Sir Cordelia, calling herself Evelina Cordelia. Her calmness betrayed no nervousness or fear of the meeting. The dungeon located beneath the Demi estate had sinister rumors. Locals said that the prisoners were not given food or drink, leaving them to their fate. Once there, the prisoners were forced to catch insects to somehow maintain their strength and survive in such cruel conditions. And unfortunately, death was the only way to escape this torment. After endless torture, the prisoners died, and this was their only chance to leave this place. These terrible rumors, alas, turned out to be true, confirming how cruel the fate of those who found themselves within these walls was. A few days ago, Evelina decided to talk to Daniel about his father's military past. The eldest son knew that his dad would not just let criminals escape, so the girl could not worry. There was no one there now. Whether you are a lord or not, you do not have the right to simply lock a person up. They need to be judged. The guards checked this place once a month, just for the sake of it, which the girl knew very well. Wandering around the dungeon, she noticed that this place had been abandoned for a long time. There were no signs of life, no traces that someone could be here. Everything looked lifeless and gloomy, but what tormented the girl's conscience most was the fact that she did not know what would happen to the guard whom the lady had stabbed. Perhaps she could have avoided the violence and saved herself without hurting him. She was not sure if she had done the right thing, and this question tormented her soul. Father would be here in a few days, and it would be around the same time as the arrival of the hikers. Evelina understood that this time seemed insignificant in comparison to what she had already experienced. Everything she had gone through seemed much more significant and difficult to her than what lay ahead. Plus, she was somewhat reassured by the fact that her bodyguard, Edward Bailey, would also be here. So if she could hold out a little longer, nothing bad would happen. Edward was her protector, and that gave her confidence despite the situation. Finally, a few days later, Evelina was found by Demi's guards. This was her last hope and the only way that remained. And although her situation was difficult, she felt that everything was already being decided, and this was her chance. As soon as the father saw his daughter nailed up in the dungeon, everything inside him seemed to turn over. On the one hand, he was indescribably happy to finally see his girl, who, according to rumors, had already been buried. But on the other hand, as a loving father, he was very sorry that everything happened this way, and the lady had to endure such torment. Now Daniel showed himself in the most terrible position he could possibly be in. The guy tried to explain everything to his father right away, insisting that he was worried about the safety of their lands. Daniel explained that, among other things, he had to keep an eye on suspicious people and that anyone in his place would have done the same. But the eldest representative of the Demi clan only shut the bastard up. This mistake defied any explanation because the young man had destroyed the chances of friendly relations with Cordelia, cut off the last chance to avoid bankruptcy. Now the boy's father pointed out the weakness of his son since he had deprived them of money. Well, at that moment, another guy appeared in the dungeon. It was Edward. "Maybe we shouldn't talk about this in front of the lady," he said, entering the dungeon. There was a sense of caution in his words, and he clearly didn't want to raise unnecessary questions so as not to disturb the situation. Edward had read that they needed to take the guests to a more suitable location first, which made sense. He knew that they needed to make everyone comfortable before they started talking. Otherwise, the situation could get out of control, which would be bad for everyone. But Daniel's reaction immediately made it clear that he wasn't entirely happy to see Edward here. The boy simply didn't understand why the Emperor's nephew had decided to visit this place. His displeasure was obvious, although Brayley only smiled sarcastically, looking at his peer, clearly enjoying the moment. Lady Evelina was the one who was most pleased to meet Edward. The girl could not hide the smile from her face as soon as she noticed the guy she knew. Her eyes sparkled, and her face immediately lit up with joy. It was unexpectedly pleasant for her, especially in such a situation. Next, Brandy asked Lucas to help the guests back upstairs, and Daniel was to go get his father. It would be better for Daniel to explain all this now. He knew that he had to tread carefully because the situation was tense and required clear decisions. While Demi's family was sorting things out, Edward told Connor that he had been looking after his daughter all this time. The guy even apologized like a true gentleman because he shouldn't have overestimated the situation and been more active because the girl had ended up in that dungeon and spent several days there. Evelina and Edward explained to her father that they had met before she had arrived at the estate. The young people were telling the truth, but they decided to leave some details out of the picture to avoid complicating the situation. Everything that was happening seemed too complicated to reveal everything at once. Evelina's father did not hold a grudge against Edward. On the contrary, the man believed that it was not easy for a knight to act on foreign territory. The most important thing was that Evelina was safe only thanks to Edward's help, and he considered his action worthy of respect. The man appreciated the importance of his help, and although the emperor's son helped the girl due to his job, this does not change the fact that he saved her. That day, Evelina herself said a huge thank you to her bodyguard. She understood that without his help, everything could have ended much worse. Edward himself considered all this to be just trifles. The guy admitted that Miss Evelina would have overcome all these difficulties without his help. From the very beginning, at their first meeting, Mr. Bailey noticed all the courage and fortitude of her character and was sure that she would cope. The father also confirmed that his daughter was very smart, which is why she was able to survive. He was sure that Evelina would not only survive all the trials, but would also learn to cope with similar situations in the future, thanks to her intelligence. After that, Dad decided to check with the girl whether she really didn't remember anything for the last 6 months. Evelina had no choice but to admit that she had absolutely no memories, and she suddenly woke up in the middle of the road, not understanding what had happened during that time. Later, the father advised his child to rest when they returned home. Then perhaps the lady would be able to remember everything. He hoped that time and rest would help his daughter restore her memory and return to normal life. But now the girl was more interested in the guy she didn't know who was standing near the door. That's why she decided to ask her dad who this man was. Connor was too busy with his daughter that he forgot to introduce him to the lady, and she felt the need to clarify. This man is Felix. From today on, he will be Evelina's personal guard. As soon as Connor introduced him, Edward's expression immediately changed. The guy seemed upset when he heard the young man's position, and his reaction left no doubt about his feelings. It was quite unexpected for the girl herself, but burdensome. Although the lady understood why her father had decided to introduce someone to her, there was still so much to do. The guard was following her. He would get in the way. Father continued to tell her that Felix was a great knight of the crown. There was no need to worry, since he was more than capable of looking after the girl. At that moment, the lady realized that no matter how much she said that she was safe now, she would not be able to get rid of this young man. Later, Edward decided to ask the Knight of the Crown why someone like him would hire himself out as a regular guard. But Felix didn't tell the truth, because it was his own personal reasons. And yet, after that, she had to show respect to the new bodyguard. So the girl got up from under the sofa, introduced herself by her name, and bowed to the guy to show that she was glad to meet him. The lady understood that for now, it was better to do what her father wanted. She would start worrying about everything later, when she returned home. Just then, Brandy and her eldest son walked into the guest room. It was time for a serious talk, and the atmosphere in the room immediately became tense. Everyone knew that this conversation would not be easy, and everyone knew that the consequences could be quite serious. They sat down at the table, made tea, and Daniel's father decided to apologize first. Brandy understood perfectly well that his son had made a terrible mistake, and in his attempts to apologize, he even bowed low before the royal family, showing his sincerity. This was his way of admitting his guilt. Daniel himself also intervened in the conversation, expressing his regrets to Lady Evelina. He tried to explain that all this happened because of a misunderstanding. His words sounded so desperate that the girl could not help but feel the tension in his voice. He was looking for a way to justify himself and regain at least some respect. But all these bows of theirs looked even more humiliating. Evelina could not understand what they were doing at all. Did they really believe that their apologies could fix the situation? She felt her patience melting, and all this seemed to her just empty words. Even Edward remarked out loud that this was more than just a misunderstanding. He added that the only thing that saved the day was Lord Brandy's return in time, otherwise the girl would have been executed by now. His words acted like a cold shower, and everyone realized how close everything had come to disaster. This was precisely what Mr. Bailey had chosen to point out. And it was a good one, since Connor had not known that his son was going to kill the girl. This moment reinforced the feeling that things could have ended terribly. Edward knew exactly how close they had come to tragedy. An attempt to be forgiven resulted in the eldest son of the Demi family falling to his knees before the lady, begging for another chance. He kissed her hand, promising to do whatever she wanted in exchange for her forgiveness and mercy. It was his last attempt to regain at least some of his respect, but Evelina herself no longer wanted to see this crazy bastard. She felt sickened by his actions. Her irritation grew stronger, and every action he took only increased her disgust. Now, when he fell to his knees before her, she felt only disgust. As soon as the girl showed her character again and abruptly pulled her hand out of the guy's kisses, the young man got angry at her. He did not understand how the Marquis's daughter could say such things to him. Anger sparkled in his eyes, but she could no longer accept his apologies. What made it even more compelling was the fact that Edward was also present here. The guy didn't understand at all what this emperor's son was doing here, because before this whole situation didn't bother him, but for some reason now he suddenly decided to intervene. At some point, Daniel even assumed that it was this blonde guy who planned everything. Planned to publicly achieve the mockery of Demi's son. The situation took an even more interesting turn when Daniel decided to approach the other side and make the girl look bad as well. The guy pointed out that he believed that the girl would definitely give him a second chance, since she herself also shares a grave sin, the murder of the guard of this house. Daniel shared that it was a guard who had been found dead, and he may not be of noble birth, but he was still an employee of their royal palace. Demi's eldest son promised that they would not simply stand by and watch their men fall dead, even if the killer was Lady Evelina Cordelia. This obsession felt extremely unpleasant for the girl. She tried not to think about it, but for some reason she still wasn't sure that someone had really died because of her. Like a heavy burden on her shoulders, the question hung in the air. The girl decided to ask directly, were they planning to charge her with murder in court? We're thinking about it, but none of us want it, right? He said, and after a pause, he offered a deal. It sounded like an attempt to avoid further conflict, but she wasn't sure it was all honest. However, it seemed like there was no choice. Meanwhile, Charlotte was running around the house in a frenzy. She was ready to find out all the details. By chance, she met Lucas and decided to ask him what had happened. Once in his presence, she learned that she had heard rumors that Sir Cordelia had indeed visited their estate, which confirmed the truth of Evelina's origins. But how wrong Charlotte was when she approached her younger brother. He quickly guessed that it was this maid who had invited the merchant to the banquet. Her attempt to find out the truth led to unexpected consequences. Junior told Osami not to worry because he wasn't going to tell his father about this. He knew they couldn't let Daniel down because of a maid. It wasn't hard to imagine what his father would say to Daniel in this situation. Lucas really wanted his brother to become a duke who always made wise and correct decisions. But this wise duke continued to negotiate with Evelina by means of blackmail. He pointed out to the girl that if the matter went to court, there would be big problems. So the guy assured that, as he had said, it would be better if the lady lay low for a while in Demi's estate. This was true for both Evelina and Connor. The situation was heating up, and the brash boy, in turn, wanted Lord Edward to be in the same submissive position. However, neither of them was going to give in, and the tension was growing. Of course, Daniel's decision sounded like complete nonsense. Counter was not going to tolerate this, and he vocally expressed his displeasure at his eldest son's desire to lock them all up here. Their tense gazes met, and no one was going to back down in this game. Edward had something to say as well. Daniel had mentioned earlier that the guard's body had been found, so the knight offered to take a look at it. He was willing to make his own adjustments and insisted on it, feeling that it was important for their investigation. Then the elder member of the family intervened. The man explained that this was impossible, since the body had been given to his family. Brandy added that the family of the deceased would prefer privacy and did not want a public viewing. Brandy also added that it would be best if all this did not spread beyond the people in this room. Miss Evelina's return, the murder of a man, if anyone found out about it, they would soon hear embellished, terrible news. Daniel's father mentioned that the girl could even be given the death sentence. There was nothing left to do, so Evelina said out loud that she understood Lord Brandy and promised him to stay here. Immediately after, a smile crept onto the face of Demi's men. The son promised to do everything possible to ensure that the lady enjoyed her stay here. After an unpleasant conversation, the girl decided to be alone with her father. Connor suggested staying here and getting used to the crazy family. But the daughter asked her father not to do this, since she herself was involved in this whole mess. That's right. The guy's father, once he found out the whole truth, yelled at his son, assuring him that this was their only way out of bankruptcy. He was ready to do anything to save their financial situation, even if it included questionable methods. But did he really expect to get any reward for this, after what he had done? The girl thought that they were sure that they would get a reward, especially after finding a weak spot in Milady. She was sure that they did not realize the gravity of their actions. It was precisely about this murder that the father was going to talk to his daughter. He asked the girl if she really did it. The question was direct, and the father did not want to hide his concern for her actions. Well, since the topic was not the most pleasant, Dad treated the girl calmly and pointed out that if it was difficult for her to talk about it now, then she could not force herself. However, he still did not forget to mention that the lady should know that this was a serious crime and the consequences could be serious. No matter if it was royalty, servant, or guard, there was no justification for committing a crime against a human being. But the nobles here didn't seem to understand that. It was an important moral, and Connor was determined to impart it to his daughter. Connor didn't know exactly what happened that night, but the safety of his beloved daughter was his top priority. He couldn't believe it had come to this, and now he had to make a decision about how to move forward. The most important thing is that the father knew that his daughter did what was necessary. He considered the girl a wise woman, and he was even simply surprised that his daughter was capable of such things. At that moment, the father noticed how Evelina had become so brave during the time that he had not seen her. This speech was so touching and sweet that the girl could not hold back her tears that evening. She hugged her father, cried, and continued to apologize to him. The feelings that overwhelmed her were strong, and she could not hold back her emotions, understanding the importance and complexity of the situation. That night, Edward decided to get some fresh air at the entrance to the palace. He also met his eldest son, Demi. The evening was warm, but the atmosphere between them was becoming tense, as neither of them was happy about this meeting. As soon as the two met, there was already an unpleasant atmosphere between them. Edward was not afraid to speak indiscreetly towards Daniel. He was confident in his words, was not ashamed to say directly what he thought about what was happening, and was not going to put up with provocations. In response, the family's eldest son, Demi, pointed out that they only wanted to show their hospitality to Osami and Miss Evelina. But Edward noticed that the boy was going out of his way and was going to throw another party. At that moment, Daniel remembered a conversation with his father. After the guy made the girl stay in their house for a while longer, he seemed proud of it and bragged to his father. Demi thought that he and the girl were one step closer to getting married. But the father was not happy about everything that happened. He was so angry with his son that he even threw the first piece of paper he could get his hands on at him. The thing is, the father was mad at Daniel because he had corrected his own mistake. It was a mistake he shouldn't have made in the first place. Now they had wasted a lot of time, which could come back to haunt them later. Besides, Brandy pointed out that one should not underestimate the Emperor's son. If he did not say a word, then everything would end. But it was also necessary to remember that Edward could not be controlled even by the Emperor, his own father. And now, when Daniel met that same son, the boy screwed into his father's head the idea that he shouldn't contradict him and not pull his hands. Brandy asked that as soon as Daniel saw the boy, he get rid of him as soon as possible. Now Daniel decided to start a conversation with Edward about how he and Evelina were quite close. After that, he decided to ask his peer how they met and how it all began. Edward calmly explained that his father had known Lord Connor and they had known each other since childhood, so Daniel had nothing to worry about. Without finishing his thought, Edward already started to say goodbye, because he wanted to go back to rest before the next day's event. Having said goodnight, Edward returned to the palace. That day, Prince Osami was still remembered in Daniel's memory as a pompous bastard. According to the plan, after the scheduled meeting with Daniel, Edward wanted to meet with Evelina. They agreed to do this in the corridor of the palace to talk quietly. Now it was time for Edward to admit that he was looking for a way out of this whole situation. The guy even promised to share his plan with the girl, considering her a strong but at the same time kind woman. It turns out that Edward knew information that the guard whom Evelina had wounded was now alive. This guy lost a lot of blood, but he survived. A newbie like Evelina couldn't hurt a trained guard very easily. Daniel and Lord Brandy just wanted to manipulate my lady, so it's not too late to fix everything. When the guy told the girl the whole truth and saw the indescribable joy on her face, he seemed to feel an unusual vibration inside. The young man did not understand what was happening to him now, but this feeling seemed quite pleasant to him. The young man assumed that it was only because he did not expect such a reaction from her. No, the real Evelina Cordelia had always been like this. This was her true nature. Fragile, but with a strength hidden within her. Like a flower in a greenhouse, she appeared delicate, but inside there was a resilience. Edward had grown accustomed to her like this, and he appreciated her strength and independence, which were obvious to the eye. After that, the girl decided to ask the guy how exactly he knew the whole truth. After all, there were only 2 other guards there, and Edward spoke as if he saw everything with his own eyes. This caused her bewilderment, because she did not understand how he could be so well informed. The girl even thought that Edward was watching her then. Although it seemed strange, in fact it was so. The guards were under his control, his acquaintances, and this meant that he knew about her actions and knew more than it seemed at first glance. In order not to ruin his reputation in the eyes of the girl, Edward decided to avoid a direct answer a little. He did not want Evelina to think that he was secretly watching her. He wondered if his answer would change anything, because in the end, the main thing is that the guard is alive. "Let's assume that it's a no," he said, knowing that even if she knew the truth, she still wouldn't change her position. He didn't want it to become a problem for her. Edward preferred to avoid unnecessary words, to avoid unnecessary questions and misunderstandings. This man looked really suspicious. He showed up in different places like the market square, the inn, and the cliff, always at the right moment. It seemed like he knew in advance what was going to happen, as if he was the link in the story. All this made the girl suspicious. But had Edward gone back in time too? Had he experienced the same thing as Evelina? The thought haunted her. Maybe he was part of her story, and everything that was happening was connected to his secret experiences. It made her wonder. To avoid such thoughts, the lady decided not to ask any more questions. She realized that it was better to distract herself and not think about what was troubling her. Maybe tomorrow would be a new day, and she would be able to sort out what was troubling her today. Then the guy asked the girl what she was going to do now. If she made this public, there would be no reason to stay in the estate. Evelina knew that the circumstances were unfair, but she decided to stay here. First of all, the girl still had so much to learn. So many plans still had to be fulfilled. According to the plot of the past life, 4 years later, the father will be framed and accused of embezzling state funds, and he will die. Then Daniel will hunt for the wealth of the Cordelia family and plan a murder. It is highly likely that the death of the father is connected with the Demi family. Now the lady knew that she simply had to keep an eye on the inhabitants of the estate. When the girl assured Edward that everything would be fine, the guy noticed at that moment that the girl looked like herself again. The same brave, courageous girl with a character that would never compare with other aristocrats. Towards the end of their conversation, Lord Lucas decided to join the boys. It seemed like an eternity since they had last met. The atmosphere had become a little tense, but at the same time, the boys were glad to see him again, even if their relationship had not always been cloudless. Lucas's first point was that he had heard of his older brother's actions and expressed his sincere regrets for it. However, Edward asked if the man was so sorry, why he did not express his feelings directly to Lord Brandy. He believed that words without actions meant nothing. Edward shared his opinion that the pity of the younger son is worth nothing if the younger one is not going to take real action. He stated that the younger brother is no different from the older one until he takes concrete steps to correct the situation. It was a harsh but fair comment on his part. Unexpectedly, Lord Lucas confirmed that Edward was indeed right in this regard. Evelina and Edward were surprised by his frankness and the fact that he not only agreed with their opinion, but also took Demi's side. They did not expect Lucas to be so decisive and not to give in to emotions. At the same time, Bailey was thinking about how he himself was not very friendly. After all, recently, almost humiliating the new guard appointed by Evelina's father, he noted that he considered him the best candidate for the role of bodyguard. While the guys continued to discuss this, Lucas quietly left, and soon it was time for Evelina and Edward to leave the conversation. Unfortunately, tomorrow the boys will have to participate in a strange party again, which will hardly bring them joy. Something told Edward that this time they will not be able to avoid the appearance of an unwanted guest, who will make this meeting even more unpleasant and difficult. That night, the entire conversation between the young people was deliberately overheard by Charlotte. She was closely following how events were unfolding and was determined to learn more so that she would be prepared for what might happen in the future. The girl did not understand why her rival was constantly hanging out with Edward Bailey. Their closeness even seemed frightening to Asami. The servant had already begun to worry about this, since the girl could tell him everything about her. Although she was sure that Milady would not say anything like that about her, since her pride would not allow her. Osami even considered this to be her advantage, because if this woman was Lord Bailey's, Charlotte would be able to throw her out of Demi's house. Now the maid was clearly sure that she would never give up just like that. Charlotte could not see being a maid forever. The next day at a social event, everyone was discussing the fact that the woman had indeed turned out to be Lady Evelina. People were talking about how good it was that no one had said anything bad about her before. The guests were also curious about what had happened to the man who claimed to work for Cordelia. During the party, Daniel was persistently hanging around Evelina, constantly offering various entertainments. He offered the girl to dance, have lunch together, drink tea, but the girl only brushed him off. She openly told him that she was only a guest at Demi's estate, and that she should not take advantage of the benefits here. Besides, Edward appeared on the horizon, who was sure that Lady Evelina was dancing with him, and, lightly hugging her, led the girl in the other direction, away from Demi's eldest son. As soon as the girl left him, Charlotte decided to appear as a replacement for the princess. The maid asked Daniel to forget about this Evelina, since the girl already belonged to Edward. The maid explained that if the young man chased after her, he could be tried for attempting to seduce someone else's girl. In addition, the girl added that no one knows what they have planned there. But such judgments of the palace employee did not please the guy at all, who was planning to marry Milady in the future. He began shouting at the maid, mentioning what he had told her several times before, that she should not approach him in public or speak to him. Then he said something that literally destroyed Charlotte. "Do you really think you can become a baroness?" After which the aristocrat ordered the girl to get out of there. But Charlotte wasn't exactly keen on becoming a baroness. How could a man with whom she had previously had an affair think that was what she wanted? Maids like Charlotte are always ignored, bullied, used as toys, objects, and then thrown out. All the girl wanted was to stop living such a miserable existence. Then, at a social event, she seduced a guy with her naked breasts and suggested that they go into seclusion together. Daniel, who had not had intimate relations for several days, fell for the girl and suggested that she follow the plan. He would go out first, and Charlotte would follow him only a couple of minutes later. Then no one would suspect anything. But it only seemed to the boys that no one noticed that they were lovers with Charlotte. During the dance with Lady Cordelia, Edward watched these two with interest the whole time. The guy hinted to his dance partner that he had learned something about Charlotte. Or rather, he had learned everything that could be interesting. But in order not to talk about it in front of other aristocrats, the young man suggested moving to a quieter place. The former duchess who lived on Demi's estate, Anne Charles, was a kind woman. When she married Brandy and moved in, she had a lot to do. But there was one maid that Evelina couldn't help but bring to Demi's house. It was a woman with a child who needed care and attention. She couldn't leave them to their fate because the baby couldn't be left alone. The child was delivered to the estate safe and sound, but the maid herself died of complications from childbirth. Evelina, feeling compassion, took pity on the baby and entrusted the maids with caring for him, asking that they raise him as their own. However, despite the efforts, the child was considered an outcast among the other children, and the maids, busy caring for the Duke's son, who was born at the same time, could not give him the attention and love he deserved. The boy remained on the periphery, and his life was not as easy as that of the other children in the house. However, this child grew up even in such an environment, despite all the isolation and coldness of those around her. And as soon as she reached the age when she could work, she herself became a servant in the house, and her name was Charlotte. This was her path, and she did not allow circumstances to break her. Her relationship with Daniel began long ago when she was young. It was a complicated relationship, but it became more complicated as the years went by. Charlotte felt more and more important and influential in the events around her with each passing year. All this confirms the fact that Charlotte was not simply used by Daniel. On the contrary, she also took an active part in the choice, influencing the decisions and property of the Cordelia family. Her role in this story was much more significant than it might seem at first glance. As soon as the guy told Evelina all this, he immediately noticed the girl's confusion. She really thought about the girl she was friends with in her past life. Well, yes, Evelina really did feel sorry for her. If Charlotte had grown up in love, her mother would not have died. If her mother had not followed the Duchess to Demi's house, Charlotte may not have had a choice to build a different life. But does that mean she lacks the ability to make decisions? She tortured Evelina, deceived her, and sometimes even tried to kill her. And not only Evelina, but the entire Cordelia family. Therefore, naturally, the heroine of this story simply could not forgive this girl for everything she did. All her actions only strengthened the hostility. But now, despite all this, Evelina was most grateful to Edward. He gave her the information she had long wanted to know. Now, finally, the truth was revealed to her, and she could understand what to do next. Edward thought that this was also relevant to their affairs. He thought it would be better to get to know Charlotte better, so that he could protect Evelina in the future. He also suggested further steps that could strengthen their position, such as rings as collateral, which would indicate a more serious commitment. But now that the girl had a personal guard from Sir Connor, the young man decided that he no longer needed to be near the beauty. Her safety was now protected, and his participation was no longer needed, in his opinion. But that day, she didn't let him go. As soon as the guy took a few steps in the other direction, she grabbed his hand, asking him to stay. Evelina still felt threatened, and her request remained unfulfilled, so she needed his support. The boy then, surprised, asked her why she had chosen him as her guard. The lady explained that he had saved her in the marketplace, and that he had then told her that they would definitely meet again, predicting that their paths would cross again. The young lady thought that if this was truly their destiny, then it would be right for the man to stay by her side. She felt that their connection had a deeper meaning than just a chance meeting. But the guy, taking his hand from under the palm of the beauty, pointed out that such things as fate do not exist. There is only the choice of the girl herself. This meant that she chose him herself, and it was her conscious choice, and not something predetermined. From tomorrow, the member of the secret order promised to seriously teach the girl how to handle a sword properly. Besides, it was obvious from the modest girl that many lessons would be needed. At least they would be able to kill time when they were here. In fact, the girl was even happy with such an offer from Edward. The name of the new bodyguard of the main character of this story is Felix. This guy was a mercenary with a cruel but fair character. He knew how to deal with difficult situations and was not afraid to work with people whose goals were not always pure. Felix was originally a knight of the order, but after becoming disillusioned with the corrupt crown, he chose the path of a mercenary. His ideals were shattered when he saw how the authorities used their power, and he decided that it was better to act by his own rules, even if it did not please others. He was busy guarding Sir Cordelia, protecting his daughter, but one day he found himself dragging a drunk woman around the palace. It was an unexpected assignment that opened up a new side of life for him. Some time ago at a banquet, Mr. Connor asked Felix to take Evelina to her room. The aristocrat had overindulged in drink and could no longer walk on her own. He agreed to help, realizing that it was a necessary service, but also a little surprised by the situation. When he found himself in this situation, he learned that Lord Brandy had offered the girl several drinks, and she had accepted one from her father. It was obvious to Felix that he should have stopped, seeing how quickly she became drunk. As Felix carried Evelina in his arms, he realized that she had taken these drinks not for pleasure, but rather out of respect for her father. He thought that a young girl should not drink so much, and was surprised at how different she was from the Evelina he had heard about earlier. From the moment she introduced herself, it seemed like she was going to avoid the new bodyguard, but now she seemed much more funny and human than he expected. Felix felt like he could treat her with respect and even interest. While Felix was carrying her, the girl suddenly woke up. Her first question after waking up was, "Where am I?" Her tone was a little confused. Felix, without making her wait, immediately answered that he was taking her to her room. The banquet was soon ending, and it was best for the girl to rest. Feeling unwell, Evelina asked him to put her down and then added that he should bring some water. He obeyed and sat her down on a nearby bench, saying that he would soon return with water and asked her to wait for him until he returned. As soon as the young man left, the girl turned her attention to the place where she now found herself. She did not know where she was now. This room was unfamiliar to her. But at the same time, the girl decided that she immediately needed to get to her bedroom to go and rest. At the same time, the head of the secret order reported full information. The senior assistant effectively coped with his duties despite Edward's absence. Everything went according to plan, and even without his direct participation, the work was at the proper level. The team worked harmoniously. Noel and Kendrick, realizing the importance of the situation, decided to find out from their boss why he was delayed here. The answer was simple. It was necessary to find out what Evelina knew. And only then would it be possible to continue to act according to the plan, having all the necessary data. Edward, calmly explaining to his assistants that he had not forgotten his duties, emphasized that their task now was to obtain information from Evelina Cordelia. This was important for the further advancement of their plan. Once the information was obtained, everything would proceed as planned. The conversation was suddenly interrupted by Evelina herself, who, due to fatigue, could barely open the front door. Without further explanation, she headed to the bed and, unable to hold on, collapsed on it, falling asleep. Apparently, the emotional load had done its job. All this, at first, just standing in the doorway. The girl, assessing the situation, came to the conclusion that this could well be evidence that the royal daughter and the emperor's son were involved in a secret love affair. Charlotte had no doubt about it. Charlotte was delighted when her suspicions were confirmed. She firmly believed that Daniel would now have no choice but to surrender. In her opinion, he had no chance of winning this confrontation with the king's son, which brought her no small amount of satisfaction. The girl, feeling that the moment had come, decided to show all this to Daniel immediately. He had to see what was happening in this room. Evelina was exhausted and soon fell asleep, so time was of the essence. Charlotte knew that to succeed, she had to find a witness, and the first person who came to mind was Lord Lucas. Just at that moment, Lucas happened to be passing by in the corridor. Charlotte, seeing him, immediately ran up and told him that she had witnessed a strange event. She saw Miss Evelina turn towards Edward's room, which seemed very suspicious to her. Charlotte then began to convince Lucas that this girl could well become the mistress of this house, and accordingly, it was necessary to prevent a possible scandal. The girl insisted that such events should be prevented so as not to damage the reputation of all of them. Charlotte, full of enthusiasm to catch someone in a secret affair, said outright that the guards had to be called. She believed that their intervention would help sort out this love affair and lead to the desired consequences. Her confidence was obvious, and she was ready to act. However, Lucas quickly cut her off, explaining that Charlotte was not Daniel's personal assistant. He made it clear that even if what she said was true, it was none of her business. Charlotte should not interfere in other people's affairs, and she should not judge what was happening. Even if Charlotte had simply tried to warn Lucas that Miss Evelina was bothering her, that still did not give her the right to interfere. Lucas had made it clear that it was not her responsibility, and that she had to respect other people's business. The guy explained that he wanted to live in a world where everyone would be free to do what they wanted, and this included Charlotte herself. But life is not always the way we want it to be. That's why the Duke asked to stop at what Charlotte had done, and that was enough. Lucas explained that if she wanted to maintain this relationship she was in with Daniel, she'd better not interfere. Yes, Lucas really knew about his brother's mistress. How could Charlotte even think that the second son of the Demi family wouldn't notice anything? It's obvious. But that evening, Lucas still felt rather uncomfortable, because he remembered the promise to the girl that she could go to the beach. Lady Evelina still had not walked with him, enjoying the sea breeze. Meanwhile, Edward was simply shocked by Evelina's behavior. The assistants tried to wake the girl, but the Knight of the Guard knew that she would not wake up so easily, since she had fallen into a deep sleep. Noel noted that it was not very pleasant because the lady was in a state of alcoholic intoxication. The guy even asked the boss if they should move her to the bedroom, but Edward asked them not to touch the girl because, most likely, she was very exhausted. It was worth giving her time to rest. Only in response, Noel asked the Emperor's son not to get so close to her. The guy did not hide the fact that he did not trust this girl. He knew that regardless of the circumstances, she, like Edward, knows the future and she must have her own plans. And if these plans get in their way, then the guys must be prepared for the worst. At that moment, the girl's new guard knocked on Edward's door. Sir Felix, not wanting to cause any inconvenience, immediately apologized for disturbing him. He did not want to interfere, but he had to report what had happened, since his job was to ensure the lady's safety. The guy went on to explain that he had been helping Evelina get to her room and then lost sight of her. Everything fell into place when the mercenary entered the room and saw his mistress sleeping on the bed. He realized that, apparently, everything that was happening was quite normal. However, Edward asked Felix not to approach the girl as she was sleeping and said that it was better to leave her alone. The knight insisted that they leave the girl in this room for the night so as not to disturb her peace. Edward preferred to take responsibility. He even promised to look after her personally, and for now told Felix to go back, assuring him that there was no need to worry about the lady's safety. "As a former member of the Order, I expect you to be able to keep secrets," the commander added, showing the guy out the door. Felix was now at a complete loss as to what to do next. He wasn't sure if he should even tell Sir Connor about this. However, on reflection, he decided that if this was really the case between Evelina and Edward, perhaps it would be best for him not to interfere. The next morning, Evelina woke up with a terrible ringing in her head. She couldn't understand why she felt so hungover, since she had only had one drink at the banquet. Her head was splitting, and her body felt completely tired and heavy, as if she had drunk a whole barrel of wine. Then Edward, noticing her condition, gently pointed out that from now on the lady would do well to abstain from drinking. When Evelina realized that she was hearing a man's voice and realized that it was Edward's voice, she felt extremely awkward. She was wearing only her pajamas, which added to her embarrassment in such a situation. At first, the miss did not understand what was happening and why Edward was now in her bedroom. And when the girl found out that it was she who was in Edward's sleeping quarters, she felt even more embarrassed. Now the lady was in front of him in only her underwear and did not want anyone to see it. The heroine decided that she had better go to her room, but before she took a step towards the door, the guy grabbed her by the arm, not letting her pass. "Good morning, Miss Drunk Lady." Her childhood acquaintance greeted her. Of course, the girl considered this offensive and responded by loudly slapping the guy on the cheek. That's how she paid for the man's being a regular on her all night. The funniest thing was that this wasn't the first time the girl had shown herself to be good at running away. The lady might regret her actions, but she simply couldn't hold back at that moment. The girl was in her underwear because she had vomited on her dress. Moreover, she could only hope that Edward hadn't changed her clothes. The girl didn't know then that it was Noel who had changed her clothes. The heroine soon realized that she had let her guard down after her father came for her. Now the girl had better get herself together and prepare for the upcoming event. Around this time, Evelina was preparing for her debut. The lady was delighted with the upcoming events. The time she spent was filled with happy moments, whether it was shopping or cozy tea parties with friends. Her life was light and joyful. But at the same time, Edward was experiencing the greatest loss. His parents died. Unfortunately, Evelina completely forgot about the details of this terrible day, which became the worst in the prince's life. The loss of his loved ones consumed him, and he plunged into his own experiences. The very day when Edward's whole life was supposed to change would come tomorrow. It would be the moment that would divide his fate into before and after. Evelina didn't know that their lives would change tomorrow, and the fact that she was preparing for her debut had nothing to do with the coming events. Some time ago, one of the members of the secret squad was forced to meet with important people in the Fran Empire. The man noticed that everything had begun to fall apart after Conrad's murder. Now, everything was going according to their plan, and the upcoming events were to play a key role in achieving their goals. For this reason, the chief reported that they should go back in time and set things right from the start. They believed that they could change the course of history if they went back at the right moment and intervened in the development of key events. In addition, the respected man asked Edward a question that made him think, would he be able to give the flower of time to someone else? It was an important decision that could affect the whole future, but for Edward himself, this someone was not just a random person. He was sure that Evelina Cordelia was the key to solving all his questions. She was the person who could reveal the whole truth, and only by collecting all the information from her, they would be able to achieve their goal. At that moment, Edward knew that if everything went according to plan, Evelina would soon end up on the guillotine with him. He himself was supposed to return to the past. But unfortunately, Evelina, having learned the truth about everything, would disappear forever. It was a tragic moment that could not be avoided. It was for this reason that Edward decided to offer Evelina the time flower. She had to go back in time with it, while still keeping the memory of the past. This was a necessary condition that could change everything. People from above reported that the girl would not even know why she had returned. She was unpredictable, and confusion in her head would make the situation worse. Therefore, the man recommended that the member of the secret order think over the possible consequences. But Edward had already decided everything for himself earlier. Back to the present. That day, Evelina set off on a long journey with her bodyguard Felix. In fact, the boys couldn't just leave the estate. The girl knew that Daniel would be furious when he found out. But at least she left a note for her father. He would take care of everything. At that moment, Felix decided to ask the princess why she had decided to leave the estate. He could not understand what had prompted her to take such a step. He was sure that there was something more to it than just a desire to take a walk. The question was simple, but its answer was much more complex than expected. Listen to me, Edward. Your parents will have an accident tomorrow, but it's a smokescreen. In reality, they will be killed. We have to save them, Edward. But the girl couldn't say it so directly. Her words were full of anxiety, but they lacked the necessary frankness. Evelina knew that she couldn't reveal the whole truth, and she couldn't tell Felix all the details. The girl understood that her lie was the only way to protect them all, at least for a while. She decided to say that she just needed fresh air. "I'm suffocating in this estate," is how she explained her behavior, not wanting to reveal more important details. In response, the girl only noted that the guy had once again noted how different she was from the image he had built of her. She was not the soft and quiet creature he had seen her as before. On the contrary, she was quite determined and independent. The word wild even seemed cute to him in the context of her behavior, but there was no time to think about that now. They had been traveling long enough, and the road was becoming increasingly difficult. The boys had covered most of the route, but there was still uncertainty ahead, and they had to be prepared for anything. This journey was just the first step in a more difficult mission. Then the boy remembered that he had been hired to be Evelina's personal bodyguard. He was supposed to get her to her destination quickly and safely. However, the thought of completing the task seemed less important to him than the mystery she was trying to hide. He tried to stay focused. Later in the evening, the young people arrived at Edward's home. It was dark, indicating that his parents had not returned home. This made them wary. Without light and without people, everything looked suspicious. Obviously, something was wrong, and they had to be prepared for the unexpected. The lady led them along a safer path, although she did not know exactly what awaited them. She assumed that they were supposed to lure out the bandits, but she was not sure of this. Evelina knew too little to be absolutely sure of her guesses. Her intuition told her that serious problems could await them. Under the pretext that there would be strange people in the area, Evelina asked Felix to search everything. The girl said that these people were suspicious and dressed as bandits. Just then, one of them joined the conversation, asking the lady if they were the ones being talked about. The man noted that they had been told that a boy and a girl would arrive in a carriage. But then one of them became convinced that the guys were not the ones they were looking for. But the robbers no longer cared that they were the ones they had come for. Since the young people already knew about today's plans of not the best people, they could not be left alive. Now the robbers intended to kill the witnesses. The sword fight began, and the tension in the air became more and more palpable. Felix, despite being a former member of a secret order, stood firm against his attackers. He easily repelled the blows of his enemies, not giving them a single chance to win. Each of his blows was precise and confident, which made him a formidable opponent. While the girl stood back, trying to figure out what plan Edward's crew could have, her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden danger. One of the bandits, sneaking up, brought a knife right to her throat. She didn't even have time to react, as the knife was already at her neck. But at the last moment, everything changed. The man, who had decided that his victim was doomed, was about to say goodbye to the fragile lady's life, but it was not to be. Evelina instantly intercepted the knife from his hands and, without thinking, delivered a piercing blow straight into his body. This unexpected turn of events made her enemies freeze in amazement. Who knew that this fragile girl could handle a weapon? It all seemed incredibly funny. The lady, who had just seemed defenseless, now easily defeated an experienced bandit. She herself could not understand what was strange about a woman holding a sword. She was confident in her abilities, and this was her natural state. her life. Be that as it may, the attention was now focused on Evelina. The lady had decided to take away all these bandits, which was her next step. The main goal was to get to Edward's carriage, but she herself was not yet sure how to do this. The situation was difficult, but she always had a chance to succeed. At that moment, her companions noticed her determination, and everything became much clearer. They realized that before they could move on, they had to eliminate the main target. The bandits were a danger, and eliminating them was essential to completing the mission. But the girl promised that everything would not go as they planned. She reminded them that Edward's crew was under the protection of his best guard. This fact made her confidently assert that it would not be so easy to resist them. She counted on Edward to help them, and at the right moment, as if by magic, Edward Bailey appeared literally out of nowhere. His presence was decisive. He was where he was expected, and as always, he knew exactly when to intervene. With his help, the situation began to turn in the right direction. And yet, when the girl was looking at the member of the secret order, one of the bandits pointed his sword right at her. Luckily, the young lady did not manage to strike too hard, so she still had access to oxygen. But still, her shoulder was not in the best position. This was primarily Edward's fault. Was he prepared for such consequences when he sent Evelina to the past? The Bailey name is his priority. Earlier, those people who gave the lightning-fast guy a chance to go to the past and correct other mistakes indicated that when they received the necessary information, they would get rid of Evelina. But was Edward prepared for such consequences? After sorting out and executing the plan, Edward first sent the girl to the doctor. Noel, seeing the melancholy of his boss, promised the milord to cure the lady. And yet, the assistant confirmed that although the wound was very close to the throat, fortunately, everything would be fine. At that time, Noel reported that the girl was accompanied by a man who called himself Felix, which literally drove Edward into a rage. The guy simply could not believe that this young man allowed her to end up in such a state. The former squad member really seemed incompetent, although, in fact, the same could be said about Edward. Still, why Evelina Cordelia came here, the guy still did not understand at all. He came here to save his parents and return everything. The events of that night were not connected with her. Although after going over everything in his head several times, the guy still came to the conclusion that the girl had arrived only to save his parents. But why did she do it? The young man still couldn't find an answer to this question. When Edward entered the beautiful lady's chamber, Felix, the guard, was sitting next to her exhausted body. He looked worried, but very focused. Edward, noticing him, immediately advised him not to tell Sir Connor about what had happened, because there was a woman in front of them whom he had to protect. And this could lead to misunderstandings. The Imperial Prince also tried to calm Felix down, assuring him that there was no need to worry about the scar on Evelina's neck. He noted that if they followed the correct treatment, the scar would heal quickly, and there would be no trace of the wound left. All this should be in the past, and the girl would soon recover. After some time, Evelina was finally able to open her eyes. She felt extremely weak, but her first question was, why was she in this place? Edward gently explained that the wound on her shoulder was not as bad as her bleeding neck. She almost died, but thanks to his intervention, everything worked out. After that, Edward couldn't help but wonder how exactly she had gotten herself into this situation. He explained that the tiny order always had access to the most sensitive information, including information about Edward's parents and his estate. Edward revealed that he had learned of a group that was going to kill his parents, and that had forced him to act. He continued by saying that he had managed to uncover the attack plans and had arrived on Demi's land before the group of criminals were to act. After that, he had teamed up with Evelina to warn his family. The girl found the story so brilliant that she even thought it had been rehearsed in advance. When the guy finished his story, it was Evelina's turn. She couldn't immediately come up with a suitable explanation because what was happening was too important to be justified by a banal walk. But Edward, without giving her time to answer, was the first to say that she did all this to save his parents. He explained that Evelina was clearly the type of person who would not stop until she had uncovered all the secrets. This seemed important to Edward, because such qualities could be useful. In her eyes, Edward might have seemed unexpected, and she was beginning to doubt what the young man really knew. The guy also added that if this was the reason why the girl was here, he had another question. Why did the lady come here? After all, if the girl knew about everything that was supposed to happen today, then she should have done something else. The girl should have come to Edward himself. But in response, the little girl only admitted that she didn't think that a member of a secret society would believe her at all. Then the guy pointed out that if that was the reason, people would just stay put. He honestly didn't understand the reason why Milady would risk it to save the parents of a stranger. It's time for the main character of this story to tell that Lord Conrad is not a stranger to her. In fact, Evelina has always been indebted to him since childhood. And the girl in her past life grieved for a long time about his death. Not only she, but also her father, who was his friend, and even Evelina's mother also grieved, as did the man's own son. But the girl couldn't tell the guy the whole truth, because it wasn't that easy to explain all her actions. That day, she only said that she didn't want to see Edward sad. It was difficult, but she knew that such moments could remain in her memory forever, and she wanted to ease his pain at least a little. Edward's expression when he lost his father was so dejected that Evelina knew it would take him a long time to recover. She couldn't help but notice how hard it was for him, and she couldn't revive his heart to see that dejected, handsome man again in a different light. At that moment, Edward was truly in shock. His thoughts were confused, and he did not know what the lady was talking about. He was not prepared for such emotions. Previously, he and the girl met in the garden to talk about something important, but this was a different situation, and Edward could not even imagine how she really understood him. The Order of the Shadow was a secret group designed to solve the most difficult and dangerous problems that were returned to the Bailey family. This order did not exist for the outside world, but only for those involved in the affairs of the Bailey family, and its activities were hidden from most. Edward had trained under strict conditions since he was a child, but the reasons why he was forced to do so remained a mystery to him. He did not understand why his life had to be so disciplined and full of restrictions, and only as he grew older did he begin to realize that his path was predetermined. When Edward was still a little boy, his curiosity did not leave him in peace, and he once asked his parents why he had to do all this, and how it was connected with the inheritance of the Bailey name. But that day, he did not receive an answer, and the question remained unresolved for him, filling his soul with even more doubts. However, his parents decided to support his further education abroad. Apparently, they felt guilty and sorry that they had to keep him in the shadows, and tried to compensate for this by giving him the opportunity to study and develop his physical abilities at the academy. It didn't matter what the elders in the family said about the young man. He had clearly decided for himself, never to return. Unfortunately, only the circumstances of his parents' death forced the guy to return. The young man remembered very well that when he stood near the grave, unable to feel his feet under the earth, he heard the cries of others. Was it an accident? But they were in a cart. Why were their bodies so mangled? Quietly he will hear. What will Bailey do now? They always held on to Lord Conrad. One day, the uncle gave the boy a special herb of thyme that played an important role in the history of their family. The man said that the family passed it down from generation to generation, and this herb was part of their family's mission, with which they had lived for centuries. Its significance was immeasurably important. The Baileys were sorcerers who had been studying herbs and medicines for generations. Their knowledge and skills were passed down from generation to generation, allowing them to be not only masters of healing, but also guardians of ancient secrets related to herbs and their magical properties. And though their research was interrupted by political responsibilities and obligations to the frontier, the Baileys' true mission remained the same: to protect the thyme herb and use it when needed. It was a duty that had to be fulfilled, despite all the obstacles the family faced. Centuries later, when the time came, the man gave Edward a task. He must go back in time, save Conrad, and restore his family. It was his obligation, a duty that could not be ignored. Edward had much to do to change the course of events and restore balance. Edward was unable to pull himself together even after the funeral, his soul overwhelmed by grief. At that moment, Sir Connor came to him to support him. His visit was laconic, but full of concern for the young man who had to not only cope with loss, but also make difficult decisions that would change the future. When the men sat down at the same table, Connor's first thought was to ask how his friend's son was doing, as they hadn't seen each other for a long time. It was a moment when old connections and memories came to the fore again, and the conversation began with an attempt to establish a personal connection in these difficult times. Edward shared his memories of his studies abroad. The guy really liked this good place. People there were open and free, unlike in Fran. It was a great opportunity to see the world in a new light. The guy would really like to thank his parents for giving him such an experience. That same day, the elder Cordelia asked the young man for permission so that the father could share the details of the trip with his daughter Evelina. He believed that the information the elder was passing on could help Evelina understand the current situation and help her in the future. Sir Connor was a good man. He felt genuinely sorry for Edward because the boy had to stay in the empty estate after the death of his parents. He was worried about him, although he realized that his sympathy could not fix the pain that the young man was experiencing. Even with his support, Edward did not feel better. Now, Edward could not find a solution to the problems he was facing. His thoughts were tormented by doubts. At one point, he thought that if he went back in time with the help of the Herb of Time, he could bring back his parents, fix this tragedy that had ruined his life. But the more he thought about it, the more senseless this solution seemed. However, the man did not want to return to the Order of the Shadow, and this feeling made him despise himself. He blamed himself for doubting the salvation of his parents, for not being able to find another way to fix everything. This struggle with himself was painful, and Edward sank deeper and deeper into his own experiences. But one day, Evelina Cordelia came to him to talk. She noticed that Edward was in a depressed state and decided to offer her help, despite the complexity of the situation. Evelina, although she did not know how to help, felt that she had to do something to support him in this difficult moment. Edward didn't want to be distracted from his thoughts. He just wanted to simply exist. At these moments, it was hard for him to accept any words of comfort because they all seemed out of place. But despite this, Evelina continued to talk, hoping to lift the weight off his soul at least a little. That day, Evelina had suggested to Edward that if he felt like crying, he should try simply focusing on the quiet sounds around him. She had said that it helped her. It was simple advice, but there was deep wisdom in it. Listening to the world around him, noticing it when everything seemed dark, might help ease his soul a little. For example, she suggested listening to leaves rustling in the wind or insects scurrying on the ground. When a person focuses on these sounds that he or she usually doesn't notice, he or she begins to free themselves from sad thoughts, at least for a little while. It was a way to restore balance, to escape pain and disappointment, at least for a moment. In fact, that was all Evelina wanted to say to him that day. Simple but important words that could become a source of peace in his restless soul. She was not trying to solve his problems, but she was offering him a way to weaken their influence a little. This conversation was deeply imprinted in Edward's memory. The person who helped him move forward, who made him look at the world a little differently, was Evelina Cordelia. In her simplicity and sincerity, Edward found comfort and strength to continue to search for a way out of his problems. Now, having returned to the present time, the girl had to tell how she got to the right place. The first thing the lady admitted was that they left the village before dawn, and she returned the same way on Felix's horse. The girl was very worried all the way. She knew too little about Edward, but she also understood that it was too late. It was too late, but she had to keep her distance. The next morning, when the girl came to, she met with Felix. The first thing the bodyguard did was to apologize to the lady, since he couldn't protect her properly. But the girl calmed him down, explaining that it was only her fault, since she herself asked to take her with him. Be that as it may, Lady Evelina is fine now thanks to Edward, and there is no need to worry about her health. After Charlotte spent the night with Daniel, the girl noticed her boss's upset look. The lady decided to ask if his father had said anything that could have affected the guy's mood. Of course, it was obvious that his father had given his eldest son a moral lecture. He had pressured Daniel to marry Evelina. However, the boy himself could not understand why this girl in particular. After all, Cordelia was not the only family with money. But now everything would not have seemed so terrible if not for his father's intervention. The boy felt trapped by his responsibilities and parental expectations, and yet Daniel told his mistress that she had nothing to worry about. He assured her that everything would be fine. Now Charlotte was thinking only about how Luke Arias could know about her dealings with the traitors. The girl decided that if she did not give information, she could simply cover her tracks, thereby avoiding unnecessary problems. 3. Daniel later voiced his observation that Charlotte was beginning to become a bit arrogant. He said it as if in jest, not attaching much importance to his words, but they still sounded quite frank. And even though it was a joke, Charlotte almost choked on her tea when she heard such remarks from her lover. She did not expect him to say it so directly. Yes, this was exactly the reaction the guy expected from her. He knew that her ego could be easily hurt, and this gave him some satisfaction because for him it was a kind of game. But this morning, Daniel said what Charlotte had been waiting to hear for so long. Yes, you are much better than this, Evelina. These words seemed simple, but for her they meant much more than they might seem at first glance. It was not just confidence in her superiority, but an acknowledgement of her place in Daniel's life. Half a day had passed since the boys had rescued Edward's parents and returned to the estate. Even though the threat had been eliminated, Edward still felt a sense of tension, as if something had not yet been completed. Neither Daniel nor Lord Demi noticed their absence, all thanks to their father. They must have been a real nuisance to him. It was written all over his face. Lord Conrad and his wife were protected by the Order of the Shadow and returned home. Evelina and Edward literally saved their lives, and thank God it happened that way. How wonderful that they finally sorted out their problems. Well, at least one task had already been solved for sure. Now the girl understood that if the fate of the Emperor's son's parents had changed, then the same could be done with her family. No, not just change. Evelina Cordelia had now set a goal to protect her family. And although the ladies still didn't know much, she felt that she was moving forward step by step. Specifically, what the girl doesn't know is the image of Edward Bailey. Edward had already explained to her how he had been warned about the plot against his parents. But his explanation was flawless, as if rehearsed. And this only confirms the fact that Evelina was right. Edward Bailey is from the future, just like herself. And now Madame decided to persistently sort everything out. But it seemed to the girl that he would not answer her if she simply asked. So the question arose before him. Should she tell him that she also came from the future? Evelina knew that if she told Edward everything, he would be very good at helping her find out the truth. Moreover, now the girl needed someone she could rely on. But then again, would Edward be on her side? What if he really was from the future? In that case, the girl still didn't know how to act further. The lady didn't know his motives and goals. She guessed that if the task was just to save the parents, but then he had already finished. Why was he still staying here? That was still unknown. After a few minutes of thinking, the girl decided that going to Edward's room was not the best decision. For some reason, something was stopping her that day. The girl thought that she should keep her distance from this guy. But what was her surprise when she accidentally met him in the corridor? The guy himself wanted to find the girl to ask her something. Now they were together in the unknown for the lady. There was a door nearby, which seemed to be connected to the corner tower, but it is under a huge lock, chained. But it is impossible to say for sure whether the girl knows detailed information about it. It is definitely a corridor that leads to the tower, but how does she know this? This place was inaccessible to her even after her marriage to Daniel. In her past life, Sophia explained that no one except Lord Brandy can go further than this place. When the miss asked why my lord asked her this, the guy only replied that he had a feeling that the lady would know. The main character of this story considered this moment the most appropriate to ask the guy her question in return. It was time to find out if he really was from the future, like herself. But once again, the girl failed to do this, because a strange scream was heard from the tower. The guys decided to break down the door to get into the forbidden room. «Die, you, destroyed!» Зрение, жена, сидящая прямо перед Лукой, закричала в полумертвом состоянии. Evelina knew this woman very well. Duchess Anne Charles. She had seen her at many balls and at court, always surrounded by attention and respect. But here, in this room, the situation had changed. The lady could not understand how Anne had ended up here, among these people. What could a dead man do here? This thought did not leave Evelina. Lucas did not even seem to notice the danger of the situation. He was completely focused on his actions, without showing the slightest surprise. His confidence confused the lady. Watching this, the lady wondered for a second if she and Demi were going to hide this woman. The situation was becoming more and more confusing with each passing moment. Evelina tried to figure out what was wrong, but the answers were far from what she expected. If this was true, if they were hiding Anne Charles, then even more questions arose. Why hide such a figure? Such an influential woman? What was the real reason for her being in this place, and what was the secret behind this decision? They kept her here, away from the public eye. It was obvious, and the reason was clearly not simple. Anne Charles could not have been in this place by accident, and everything around her suggested that something important was hidden behind her presence here. Literally a second later, the woman, driven by some incomprehensible impulse, grabbed Lucas and dragged him to the window. Without any hesitation, she tried to strangle the guy, desperately trying to get rid of him. Everything that was happening caused Evelina even more questions than answers. Edward simply couldn't watch this calmly, so he decided to strike Anna first. The man understood that they would both die if he hadn't intervened. And now he had turned this woman simply unconscious, without killing her. Besides, Lucas was also unconscious now, and it seemed he hadn't seen the young guys. Now the body, which is unconscious, looks quite calm. But the screams before, "Die, Lucas, I said die!" She cursed Lucas, but why? Then the girl noticed that something was on the floor. They were dolls. When the girl looked at them carefully, she realized that these were the same dolls that she had already met in the underground dungeon. But why did they all have blonde hair and blue eyes? Did Anna Charles really hate her son that much? Miss picked up one doll to show my lord that it was of poor quality, but all of these dolls resembled Daniel and Lucas. They could really be real voodoo dolls. At the same time, Edward did not think that the woman hated her sons. Maybe her life in marriage had brought her to this. Edward's father had told many times before that Anne, the Marquise's daughter, had a fiancé. They were known in the city as a loving couple. But one day, Anne became a duchess. There was no news of the engagement being broken. Father Bailey remarked that this was strange, and although Edward did not know all the details of the poor girl's life, he was sure that she could not have been so opposed to marriage if she did not have some serious reasons. Her eyes clearly reflected anxiety, and this was further confirmation that her wishes were not heard. The only question is, did Lord Brandy love Anna Charles? Perhaps that is why he forced her to marry him, although he already had a fiancé. Or was it done for some other purpose? Maybe he used her for his own selfish purposes? And why was she here? Too many mysteries. Still, Edward suggested thinking about it later. Right now, it was more important to get out of here. The knight had already called a subordinate who was supposed to take Lucas to his room. Protecting Anna Charles was what needed to be done, although it might be better to leave her here. If they hadn't found these people, everything could have ended tragically. But fate had decided otherwise, and Evelina couldn't understand how it could have ended if she hadn't intervened. Everything was as it should have been, but there was still uncertainty. After seeing this, the main character remembered how in his past life, Lucas died from the same disease as his mother. He dreamed of meeting her. But now she realized that this version did not match what Lucas told her about how his mother died during the epidemic. This made her doubt the veracity of his words. But what if that's how they died? Lord Brandy, ashamed by his mad wife's actions, declared that she died of illness. But only Daniel and Lucas knew the truth about her death. Evelina tried to piece together the facts, but the story became increasingly confusing. Even if Lucas had fallen to his death from the tower with Anna, they would not have been able to reveal the truth because they had kept Anna locked up there. If this is true, Lucas and Anna Charlie are Lord Brandy's victims, just like the main character of this story. The family did not stop Brandy Demi, but now Edward and Evelina saved them. Saved two more from death. If Evelina can continue, this will not be the last human life saved. And yet the girl was forced to admit to the member of the mysterious order that she was very scared. They had just saved two people, done the right thing, a good thing. But this was truly frightening, interfering in other people's affairs, life and death. The lady admitted that she felt as if she was taking on a responsibility she could not handle. And Edward Bailey actually understood and knew from his own experience what this unpleasant feeling was. It was precisely this lead-in that led the girl to finally ask the very question that had been bothering her all this time. "Edward, do you know the future?" "No, are you from the future?" the girl asked. The lady made it clear how much she wanted the guy to tell her the truth. In response, the man first pretended that he did not understand what the girl was talking about. He asked her to explain what "to be in the future" meant, because in his opinion, Such a thing does not exist, and it is simply impossible. He tried to convince her that she was wrong, but his words sounded rather unconvincing. However, the lady did not fall for his acting. She firmly asked him to stop playing the fool in front of her. Evelina clearly understood that he was hiding something important, and she was not going to waste time on his empty excuses. She was determined to find out the truth. The man continued to shift the focus, asking the girl why she was asking such questions. He noted that she didn't look like she was joking, which made him even more doubtful of her intentions. In fact, Edward was trying to figure out whose side the reincarnated miss was on. The girl herself was completely stumped. She couldn't tell him the whole truth because that would confirm that she really was from the future. Evelina realized that she couldn't confess her secret to Edward, and she also felt that he was hiding something from her. In the end, the lady decided to simply apologize for her words and forget about what she had said. She did not want to deepen the conversation and risk revealing her intentions even more. Evelina felt that it would be better not to continue the topic. Edward, in turn, told the young lady that she was tired and needed rest. Unfortunately, there could be nothing more between them, since neither he nor she could take a step towards each other. Both remained in their own world, not ready to open up to each other. Now the main character was sure that she should just use him without revealing her intentions. Before saying goodbye to the guy that day, the lady asked the knight to let her know about something else. The girl wanted to find out what happened to the Charles family after Anne Charles became the Duchess. After the tower was shaken, the morning came. Every day when the sun rose, the girl counted how many more days she had to spend here. Evelina Cordelia should be able to leave whenever she wants. Since they proved that your guard was alive during the night, the Mad Demi family has no reason to keep the lady here anymore. But the Countess also understood that she must stay here until she gets what she needs, to protect her family. But today, something happened that the girl least wanted. During breakfast, Brandy suggested that the lady think about marrying his Daniel. The union of the Duke's and Marquise's families does not benefit the former from the latter, but the Marquise family receives the same respect and communication as the Duke's, so the Marquise side will win. By proposing to marry the eldest son, everything is leading to one thing. There is an ulterior motive. Lord Brandy wants Cordelia's fortune. And Evelina already knows this, but his shamelessness is disgusting. He has already spoken to the father of the beauty many times, but now Brandy is drawing the girl herself in, because the father refused him. Now the unpleasant man assures that the most important thing is the children's feelings, all because the man thinks Evelina is weak, a sweet and innocent daughter. It was the same the first time. The wedding was decided before the lady realized what was happening, but this time the girl knew for sure that everything would not work out that way. The girl politely thanked Lord Brandy for the invitation, but then immediately apologized and then made it clear that she wanted to marry the man she loved. In response, Brandy just laughed loudly. The man pointed out to Sir Connor that he had raised his daughter well. Love? Yes. For this, marriage is needed. What is more important than the union of two people? But we, have a different story. The man began to explain that few marry for love. The unpleasant fellow went on to insist that marriage was more of what he called a deal, as it was in his case. Of course, he didn't love Anne Charles. A few days ago, Edward told the main character of this story about the Marchioness Charles. And although the guy didn't know much, he heard about her before he went to study abroad. Edward said that the Marchioness lost all her fortune. If Evelyn's premonitions are correct, it was Brandy who did this to Anna Charles. All the estates of a dead wife go to her husband. He destroyed her family and took everything from her. You are right, Lord Brandy. As the daughter of a marquis, I think I should accept this offer. The girl suddenly stated, but then she explained that as Evelina Cordelia, she would not accept the proposal because the man she loved was so close. The girl pointed out that as a true aristocratic lady of the Kingdom of Fran, she simply could not neglect it. At that moment, for some reason, Daniel's father thought that now the conversation would be about Lucas, his second son, whom the princess might have fallen in love with during his stay in the Kingdom of Demi. But then the girl shocked the men even more with her statement that it was Lord Bailey. The girl decided to hide her thoughts and continue using him. I am in love with Lord Bailey, the young lady said in a deliberately trembling voice. The lady had to do this to survive. Meanwhile, Edward, unsuspecting, was relaxing in a hot bath. And although the young man didn't know anything yet, his sixth sense told him that something was about to happen. Who would have thought that the future in this life would be like this?